Hey guys, Rusty Historian here, and tonight we're diving into something that's going to make you grateful for your memory foam mattress and blackout curtains. The absolutely bizarre, terrifying, and downright gross sleep habits of Wild West people. So before you get too comfortable in your climate-controlled bedroom, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's good to know you, and to feel that the work we put in is being seen. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, though you might lose your appetite when we get to the part about bedbugs the size of your thumb. And let's jump in. Picture this. It's 1875, and you're bone-tired after a 14-hour day of herding cattle, mining for gold, or trying not to get shot in a saloon brawl. Your back aches, your feet are screaming, and all you want is 8 hours of peaceful sleep. Well, tough luck, partner. Because in the Wild West, a good night's sleep was about as rare as an honest politician or a bathtub with running water. You're about to discover why cowboys slept with one eye open. And it wasn't just because of outlaws. You'll learn about bedtime rituals that would make a medieval peasant say, "That's gross," and sleeping arrangements that would violate every health code ever written. We're talking about a time when bedbugs wasn't just an expression, when sharing a bed with strangers was normal, and when your pillow might literally be a saddle. So buckle up, because we're about to explore the wild, weird, and wonderfully disgusting world of frontier sleep. Trust me, after this, you'll never complain about your neighbor's loud music again. Let me paint you a picture of a typical frontier town at bedtime, circa 1870. You walk down the main street, if you can call a muddy strip of land with wooden planks thrown over the worst puddles a street, and the smell hits you first. It's not just one smell, it's a symphony of stenches that would make a skunk pack up and move to a nicer neighborhood. Horse manure, human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and something that might be a dead animal but could just as easily be someone's dinner from last week. The sun's going down, but don't expect things to get quieter. If anything, the real party's just starting. Saloons are belching out drunken cowboys, prostitutes are calling out prices that would make your grandmother faint, and somewhere in the distance, you can hear what sounds like either a cat fight or someone trying to play the fiddle with their feet. You stumble into the only boarding house in town, desperate for a bed. The proprietor, let's call him Dirty Dan because everyone was called some variation of dirty something back then, greets you with a smile that reveals exactly 3 teeth and breath that could strip paint. "That'll be 50 cents for a bed," he says, and you think, 50 cents? That's not so bad. Oh, you sweet summer child. You have no idea what you just signed up for. Follow me up these creaking stairs that sound like they're 1 footstep away from collapse. Don't worry about that brown stain on the wall. It's probably just tobacco juice. Probably. You reach the 2nd floor, and Dan throws open a door to reveal your room. I use that term loosely, because what you're looking at is less room and more human storage facility. Picture a space about the size of a modern studio apartment. But instead of 1 person living there are 20 beds crammed in like sardines in a can. And I do mean crammed. You literally cannot walk between most of them. If you need to get to the bed in the corner, you're going to be stepping on, over, and possibly through other people. But here's the kicker, and this is where it gets really fun. Those aren't 20 individual beds. Oh no, that would be too civilized. What you're looking at are 10 double beds, which means you, my friend, are about to become intimately acquainted with a complete stranger. Find an empty spot. Dan grunts, already heading back downstairs to count his money. You scan the room. There's a bed in the middle with what appears to be a mountain man who hasn't seen soap since the Polk administration. He's snoring so loud the windows are rattling, and there's a distinct possibility he's hibernating until spring. There's another bed with a cowboy who's mumbling in his sleep about something that sounds like either his horse or his mother. It's hard to tell which. His boots are still on, and they look like they've been used to stomp out campfires. In the corner, there's a prospector whose beard is so long it's literally hanging off the side of the bed like a hairy waterfall. You're pretty sure something just moved in there and you really don't want to know what it was. But wait, you spot it. A bed with only 1 occupant. He's a small guy, probably a shopkeeper or clerk. He looks cleanish. This might not be so bad after all. You approach cautiously. The man opens 1 eye. "You getting in or what?" he asks. "I don't bite. Usually." "Usually?" "Usually." Let me explain something about frontier sleeping arrangements that might shock your modern sensibilities. Sharing a bed with a stranger wasn't just common, it was expected. Hotels, boarding houses, inns, even private homes operated on the assumption that beds were for sleeping, period. Your personal space ended at your nose. This wasn't just poor people making do. We're talking about everyone from traveling businessmen to judges to preachers. The idea that you might want to sleep alone was considered not just wasteful, but downright suspicious. What were you hiding? Were you sick? Antisocial? Planning to rob the place? So you climb into that bed with your new friend, trying to maintain some dignity. You attempt to lie on the very edge of the mattress. And I use the term mattress generously here, Because what you're lying on is basically a sack of straw, corn husks, or if you're really lucky, feathers from birds that probably died of natural causes. Your bunkmate rolls over, and you discover several things simultaneously. First, he apparently subscribes to the frontier philosophy that bathing is dangerous to your health. He smells like a combination of leather, tobacco, and something that died inside a boot. Second, he's what we might politely call a restless sleeper. Every 5 minutes, he's kicking, turning, muttering, or making noises that sound like a steam engine with digestive issues. Third, and this is important, he's brought friends. Not human friends. 6-legged friends. Lots of them. Oh, you thought you were just sharing the bed with one person? How adorable. See, every person who climbed into that bed brought their own ecosystem with them. We're talking about fleas, lice, bedbugs, and probably some insects that science hasn't even discovered yet. It was like a Noah's Ark situation, except instead of saving animals from a flood, you were providing an all-you-can-eat buffet for every parasite within a 50-mile radius. Bedbugs in the 1870s weren't the tiny, almost cute pests you might find in a sketchy motel today. Oh no, these were frontier bedbugs. They'd been living rough, eating tough cowboy blood, and they were about the size of your thumbnail and twice as aggressive as a rabid wolverine. You're lying there, trying to get comfortable when you feel the first bite. It's on your ankle. You scratch it and try to ignore it. Then there's another one on your arm, then your back, then places I won't mention in polite company. Within an hour, you sound like a one-man percussion section, scratching and slapping at things you can't see in the dark. Your bunkmate doesn't seem bothered. He's probably been living with these things so long they've formed a symbiotic relationship. First time, he asks, without opening his eyes. First time what? Sleeping rough. You'll get used to it. Takes about 6 months for your blood to get bitter enough that they don't like it much. Almost 6 months? 6 months? You're planning to be out of this hellhole by sunrise, and he's talking about a 6-month adjustment period? But wait, it gets worse. Because those bugs, they're just the opening act. Just as you're starting to drift off, probably from blood loss, the real entertainment begins. It starts with old Pete in the corner. Old Pete, you discover, has what we might charitably call a breathing problem. Well, see, what he actually has is sleep apnea so severe it sounds like a freight train having an argument with a dying walrus. He stops breathing for what feels like forever, and just when you think he might have finally shuffled off this mortal coil, he lets out a snort that rattles the entire building. Then there's Mexicali Joe, who apparently talks in his sleep. But he doesn't just talk. He carries on entire conversations with people who aren't there. Tonight, he seems to be negotiating the price of a horse with his deceased grandmother. The negotiations are getting heated. In the bed next to you, 2 prospectors are playing cards by candlelight at 2 a.m., because apparently the concept of bedtime is more of a suggestion than a rule out here. Got any threes? One whispers. Go fish, the other responds. This ain't go fish, you idiot. We're playing poker. Oh, well, I fold. Meanwhile, someone near the window has developed what sounds like consumption. He's coughing every 30 seconds with the regularity of a church bell, except instead of calling people to prayer, he's calling them to question their life choices. And through it all, the fleas are having their own little festival. You can actually hear them jumping. Not 1 or 2. Dozens of them, bouncing around like tiny acrobats putting on the world's most irritating circus. You close your eyes and try to remember why you thought coming west was a good idea. But wait, and I know you're thinking, it can't possibly get worse, but oh, sweet naive viewer, it absolutely can. We haven't even talked about the smell yet. Remember how I mentioned that bathing was considered dangerous to your health? Well, it turns out that when 20 people who haven't washed in weeks are packed into a room with no ventilation, the air becomes less air and more poisonous gas cloud. It's not just body odor, though. That's certainly the foundation of this olfactory nightmare. It's layers upon layers of funk. There's the smell of unwashed clothes that have been worn for months. There's the aroma of leather that's been soaked in sweat, rain, and things we won't discuss. There's the scent of tobacco juice, rot-gut whiskey seeping through pores, and dental hygiene practices that would make a cave dweller weep. But the real piece to resistance is coming from the corner, where someone has apparently decided that the chamber pot is more of a suggestion than a requirement. The actual chamber pot, a delightful ceramic bowl that serves as the room's communal toilet, is overflowing, and I don't mean getting full, I mean actively overflowing onto the floor. Nobody seems concerned about this. In fact, when you mention it to your bunkmate, he just shrugs. Better than the last place, he says. That place, the pot was in the middle of the room. The middle of the room. You're beginning to understand why so many cowboys died young, and it wasn't all gunfights and cattle stampedes. Now, let's talk about climate control. You know how in modern hotels, there's always that one person who wants the air conditioning at Arctic blast levels while someone else wants it to feel like a tropical rainforest? Well, imagine that same conflict, but with 20 people, no air conditioning, and only one window that may or may not actually open. It's July in Kansas, which means the daytime temperature was somewhere around surface of the sun degrees. The building has been baking all day like a giant wooden oven, and now all that heat is trapped inside with 20 sweating, breathing, fermenting human beings. But here's the thing. Half the guys in the room are convinced that night air is deadly. They've got the window sealed shut and blankets pulled up to their chins because everyone knows that night air causes consumption, fever, and probably moral decay. The other half are slowly dying of heat exhaustion and begging for someone to open a window before they spontaneously combust. "Open that window and you'll kill us all," shouts a man who's wrapped in 3 blankets and still shivering. "Leave it closed and you'll definitely kill us," responds a cowboy who's stripped down to his long johns and is using his hat as a fan. This argument continues for approximately 2 hours. Nobody's sleeping anyway, so why not have a philosophical debate about air circulation? Meanwhile, you're discovering that Victorian-era long underwear, which, by the way, you're expected to wear year-round, is essentially a personal sauna. You're pretty sure you've sweated off about 10 pounds, and you've only been in bed for 3 hours. Just when you think things might be settling down, you hear heavy footsteps on the stairs. The door bangs open, and 3 more men stumble in, clearly having just finished their shifts at the saloon, mine, or possibly jail. "Any room?" one of them calls out. Now, you're looking around this packed room thinking, room? Are you kidding me? There's barely room for the people already here to breathe. But apparently, frontier hospitality knows no bounds. Somehow, people start shifting, squeezing and rearranging like a human Tetris game. Your bunkmate rolls towards you, and I mean practically on top of you, to make room for one of the newcomers. "Don't mind if I squeeze in here," says the new guy, climbing over 3 people to wedge himself into a space that wouldn't comfortably fit a small dog. The other 2 newcomers find similar arrangements. One crawls under a bed and apparently decides that's good enough. The other one spots what might be 18 inches of floor space and declares it luxury accommodations. And here's the really amazing part. They're all so exhausted that within 10 minutes, they're fast asleep. Meanwhile, you've been lying there for 4 hours and haven't even dozed off once. You're starting to suspect that successful frontier sleeping requires some sort of special skill set that you clearly lack. Around 4 a.m., just as you're finally starting to drift off, the early shift begins. See, in a frontier town, someone's always working. The mine operates around the clock. The saloons never really close, and cattle don't take days off. So while you're dreaming of clean sheets and privacy, old Pete in the corner is getting up to start his day. This involves approximately 15 minutes of the most violent coughing you've ever heard, followed by what sounds like him trying to hawk up his internal organs. Then he starts getting dressed, which in the dark involves a lot of stumbling, cursing, and accidentally stepping on other people. He kicks over the chamber pot. Remember the overflowing one? And now that delightful aroma has spread across half the floor. "Sorry, boys," he whispers, which is like whispering during a thunderstorm. "Didn't see that there." Nobody responds, because everyone's pretending to be asleep in the hopes that if they ignore him, he'll somehow become quieter. The strategy works about as well as you'd expect. Pete continues his morning routine, which apparently includes gargling with what smells like paint thinner, practicing his harmonica, and having a loud conversation with Jesus about the weather. By 4:30, 3 more people are getting up. By 5 a.m., half the room is awake and moving around. By 5:30, someone has lit a kerosene lamp, and you realize you can finally see what you've been sharing space with all night. You immediately wish you couldn't. In the flickering lamplight, your accommodation looks like something out of a horror novel written by someone with a particularly twisted imagination. The floor is a patchwork of stains, mysterious puddles, and objects you can't identify and don't want to. The walls are covered in what might be tobacco stains, or might be other bodily fluids, or might be abstract art created by people with no artistic training and questionable hygiene. Your fellow guests look like extras from a zombie movie. There's the mountain man, whose beard has somehow acquired what appears to be an entire ecosystem overnight. Well, something is definitely living in there, and it might be paying rent. There's Mexicali Joe, who apparently sleeps with his mouth open and has drooled a puddle the size of a dinner plate onto his pillow. His mustache is so encrusted with substances that it's standing up by itself. The cowboy who was mumbling about his horse has somehow managed to sleep in a position that defies several laws of physics. His leg is over his head, his arm is twisted behind him at an impossible angle, and he's still snoring peacefully. And your bunkmate, remember, the cleanish little guy who seemed harmless, has spent the night slowly migrating across the bed like a human glacier. You wake up to find him essentially spooning you, one arm thrown across your chest, breathing directly into your ear. When he wakes up and realizes the situation, he doesn't apologize or move away. Instead, he looks at you hopefully and asks, "You married?" Now let's talk about morning routines, because you're going to need to use the facilities, and this is where things get really interesting. Remember that overflowing chamber pot? Well, that's not just decoration, that's the bathroom. For everyone. All 20-plus people who've been drinking rot-gut whiskey and eating beans for dinner are expected to share one ceramic pot that's roughly the size of a large mixing bowl. There's no privacy, no separate facility, and definitely no toilet paper. What there is, if you're lucky, is a stack of corn cobs in the corner and maybe some old newspaper. If you're unlucky, well, let's just say pioneer ingenuity knew no bounds. The morning rush to use this facility is like watching a very disturbing version of musical chairs. Grown men literally line up, shifting from foot to foot, engaging in negotiations about turn-taking that would make international diplomats proud. "I just need 30 seconds, pleads one cowboy. "That's what you said last time, and we all know how that turned out," responds another. "That was different. I'd had beans." "You have beans every night." Meanwhile, the pot is making ominous sloshing sounds, and you're pretty sure the structural integrity is compromised. Some of the more experienced frontiersmen have given up on the pot entirely and are making use of the corner behind the curtain. The curtain, by the way, is less of a privacy screen and more of a theater scrim. You can see everything that's happening back there, whether you want to or not. And you definitely don't want to. After dealing with the bathroom situation, and I use the term dealing with in the loosest possible sense, you might be thinking about washing up. Oh, you sweet, optimistic soul. There's one wash basin for the entire room. 1. It's about the size of a large soup bowl, and it contains what was once water, but now looks like something you'd find at the bottom of a mine shaft. Floating in this murky liquid are the remnants of everyone who's used it before you. There are whiskers, mysterious particles that might be food or might be something else entirely, and a film on the surface that reflects light like an oil slick. The soap, if you can call it soap, is a gray bar that's been worn down to the size of a large pebble. It smells like lye and dead fish and feels like sandpaper soaked in bacon grease. The towel is a piece of fabric that might have been white sometime during the Buchanan administration. Now it's a color that doesn't exist in nature and has the consistency of leather. You're pretty sure using it would actually make you dirtier than you were before. Most of the men skip washing entirely. They might rinse their hands in the questionable water, but that's about the extent of personal hygiene. Some splash a little water on their faces and call it good. The more fastidious frontiersmen, and by fastidious, I mean the ones who wash more than once a month, have learned to get up at 3 a.m. to use the facilities while they're still relatively clean. This, of course, means waking everyone else up, but desperate times call for desperate measures. After this refreshing morning routine, it's time for breakfast. Don't get too excited. We're not talking about a continental breakfast with fresh fruit and pastries. The boarding house offers one meal option, whatever didn't kill anybody yesterday. This usually consists of beans, hardtack, which is basically a cracker that could be used as building material, and coffee so strong it could dissolve metal. Everyone crowds into the dining room, which is really just the same room you slept in with the beds pushed to one side. The tables are planks of wood balanced on sawhorses, and the chairs are anything that can support human weight. More planks, boxes, barrels, and in some cases, other people. The proprietor's wife, let's call her Dirty Diane to maintain the theme, serves up the grub with all the enthusiasm of someone attending her own funeral. She's got hair that's been styled by a windstorm and a dress that's been through at least 3 Indian wars. "Beans," she announces, slapping a ladle full of what looks like brown soup onto a tin plate. "Coffee." Another slap, this time with liquid that's so dark it seems to absorb light. "Bread." She tosses a chunk of something that bounces off your plate and onto the floor. The man next to you picks up the bread, examines it, and takes a bite. It sounds like he's chewing gravel. "Not bad today," he says approvingly. "Yesterday's was harder." You look at your breakfast. The beans are moving slightly, which you hope is just from the heat. The coffee is so thick you could probably stand a spoon in it. The bread appears to be a biological weapon disguised as food. Around the table, grown men are attacking this meal with gusto. They're actually enjoying it. Some are asking for seconds. You're beginning to realize that frontier life wasn't just hard. It was a complete redefinition of human survival standards. But here's the thing that's really going to blow your mind. Some people had figured out how to make this system work for them. They were the professional frontier sleepers, and they had developed techniques that would impress a Navy SEAL. Take Sagebrush Sam, for instance. Sam had been living rough for so long that he could fall asleep anywhere, anytime, under any conditions. Thunderstorm? No problem. Gunfight in the street? Barely noticed. Sharing a bed with a man who hadn't washed since the gold rush? Tuesday night. Sam had developed a series of pre-sleep rituals that were like watching a master craftsman at work. First, he'd scout the room and identify the best sleeping positions, not the most comfortable, but the most strategic. He wanted to be near a window for air, far from the chamber pot for obvious reasons, and positioned so he could make a quick exit if trouble started. Then he'd negotiate with his bunkmate. This wasn't just about personal space. It was about establishing ground rules. No kicking, no talking, no midnight snacking, and absolutely no touching unless the building was on fire. Sam traveled with his own pillow, a leather pouch filled with sand. It was heavy, it was hard, and it was completely bug-proof. He'd wrap it in an oilcloth to keep it clean and use it as a weapon if necessary. He also had his own blanket, which he never shared and never let touch the bed. He'd spread it over himself like a shield, tucking the edges under his body to create a protective cocoon. But Sam's real secret weapon was his attitude. He'd accepted that frontier sleeping was going to be horrible, so he stopped fighting it. Instead of lying there all night complaining about the bugs, the smell, and the noise, he'd just pick the least horrible option and make the best of it. Sleep is like death, he once told me. You're not going to enjoy it, but you got to do it, so might as well get it over with quick. Now, you might be wondering what happened to the women in all this. Were they sleeping in the same conditions as the men? Oh, you innocent lamb. It was worse. So much worse. See, the frontier had very strict ideas about propriety and respectability, which meant that women couldn't just share beds with random strangers like men did. This sounds civilized until you realize that it meant women often had to sleep in storage closets, hallways, or shared rooms that were somehow even more crowded than the men's dormitories. A typical ladies' room in a frontier boarding house might have 15 women crammed into a space designed for 5. They'd be sleeping 3 or 4 to a bed with no privacy whatsoever. And unlike the men, who could strip down to their long underwear, women were expected to remain fully dressed at all times. Imagine trying to sleep in a corset in July in Kansas with 3 other people pressed against you while maintaining perfect modesty and ladylike behavior. The women developed their own survival strategies. They'd take shifts sleeping. Some would sleep for 4 hours while others sat up and kept watch. Then they'd switch. They created intricate systems of shared belongings and mutual protection. They also had to deal with problems the men didn't face. Like, what do you do when nature calls in the middle of the night, but the chamber pot is 3 rooms away and you're not supposed to walk around a boarding house alone after dark? The answer, usually, was that you didn't. You held it until morning, which led to its own set of health problems that we probably shouldn't discuss in detail. And what about the kids? Oh, the kids had it figured out better than anyone. Frontier children were basically tiny survival experts. They'd been dealing with impossible sleeping conditions since birth, so they'd adapted in ways that would make evolutionary biologists weep with joy. Kids could sleep through anything: gunfights, thunderstorms, adults having screaming arguments 3 feet away. None of it mattered. They'd curl up in spaces that adults couldn't even fit into and sleep like babies, which technically some of them were. They were also immune to bugs. Not literally. They got bitten just as much as everyone else, but they didn't seem to notice or care. They'd wake up covered in flea bites and immediately start planning their day without a single complaint. Children shared beds with their siblings, their parents, and often with other families' children. A typical frontier family bed might contain 2 parents and 5 kids, all arranged like puzzle pieces to maximize space efficiency. The kids also served as living heaters. In the winter, when frontier buildings had all the insulation properties of a screen door, children were strategically positioned around the bed to keep everyone warm. The smallest kids went in the middle, surrounded by the bigger kids, with the adults on the outside to block the wind. It was like a human layering system, and it actually worked pretty well, at least until someone had to get up to use the chamber pot and had to crawl over 6 other people to get there. The sleeping situation I've described so far is basically summer conditions. Winter was a completely different kind of nightmare. In winter, the problem wasn't heat and bugs. It was cold and death. Frontier buildings in winter were only marginally warmer than sleeping outside. The windows had no glass, just shutters that blocked wind, but not cold. The walls had gaps you could stick your hand through. The floors were bare wood with spaces between the boards. The only heat source was usually one pot-bellied stove in the main room, and it had to heat the entire building. This meant that if you were sleeping anywhere other than directly next to the stove, you were going to be cold. Not chilly, cold enough that you could see your breath indoors. In winter, the bed-sharing rules changed completely. Instead of trying to maintain personal space, everyone piled together like a pack of wolves. The goal was survival, not comfort or dignity. A winter bed might contain 6 or 8 people, all pressed together under every blanket, coat, and piece of fabric they could find. They'd sleep in their clothes, including boots and hats. Some people slept with heated rocks or bricks to keep warm. The really smart frontiersmen would heat up stones by the fire, wrap them in cloth, and use them as personal heaters throughout the night. Of course, if the cloth came loose, you might wake up with a rock-shaped burn on your leg, but that was better than freezing to death. Summer, as we've discussed, brought its own special hell. The heat was brutal, but it was the bugs that really made life interesting. In addition to the bedbugs, fleas, and lice we've already covered, summer brought mosquitoes the size of small birds. These weren't modern mosquitoes that give you a little itchy bump. These were frontier mosquitoes that had been feeding on buffalo and bears and wild horses. They were aggressive, they were huge, and they traveled in swarms that could darken the sky. Sleeping in summer meant choosing between suffocation and being eaten alive. If you covered up to protect yourself from bugs, you'd overheat and possibly die of heat stroke. If you left skin exposed, you'd wake up looking like you'd fought a war against miniature vampires. Some people tried sleeping under blankets anyway and just accepted the heat. Others tried sleeping outdoors where there might be a breeze, but that exposed you to even more bugs, plus snakes, wild animals, and the occasional outlaw looking for someone to rob. The most popular summer sleeping strategy was something called smoking out. People would build small, smoky fires near their sleeping areas to drive away the bugs. This worked to some extent, but it also meant you were breathing smoke all night and waking up smelling like a smoked ham. Speaking of sleeping outdoors, let's talk about camping, frontier style. When the boarding houses were too expensive, too crowded, or too disgusting even by frontier standards, people would sleep outside. This sounds romantic until you realize that camping in the 1870s meant sleeping on the ground with whatever blanket you happened to own and hoping nothing ate you during the night. Your bed was whatever spot looked least likely to kill you. A patch of grass if you were lucky, dirt if you weren't, rocks if the universe really had it in for you. Your pillow was your saddle, your boots, or the crook of your arm. Your blanket had to serve as mattress, sheet, and protection from the elements all at the same time. Most frontier blankets were wool, which meant they were warm when dry, but took forever to dry out when wet. They would get wet, because frontier weather was about as predictable as a drunk cowboy with a loaded gun. The sounds of the frontier at night were like a horror movie soundtrack. Coyotes howling, wolves hunting, owls screeching, and things moving in the bushes that you really hoped were rabbits, but probably weren't. Then there were the snakes, rattlesnakes, copperheads, and other varieties of "this will kill you" that were attracted to body heat. Smart campers would sleep with their boots inside their blankets to prevent snakes from moving in during the night. But even with all these dangers, a lot of frontiersmen preferred sleeping outdoors to sleeping in boarding houses. At least outside, you knew what you were dealing with. Now let's talk about the Cowboys, because their sleeping situation was in a category all its own. Picture this. You're on a cattle drive with 30 other men. You've been riding for 12 hours through dust, heat, and the occasional stampede. You're bone-tired, saddle-sore, and desperately in need of sleep. Your bedroom for the night is wherever the cattle stop moving. This might be near a stream if you're lucky, but it's probably just a random patch of prairie with no shelter, no facilities, and no protection from the elements. Your bed is the ground. Your pillow is your saddle. Your blanket is whatever you've managed to keep dry during the day's ride. Your roommates are 30 other men who haven't washed in weeks, plus a few thousand head of cattle who don't care about your need for quiet. The cattle don't sleep like normal animals. They're constantly moving, lowing, and doing cattle things that create a continuous background noise like a very large, very smelly orchestra tuning their instruments. You're also sleeping with one ear open for trouble. Rustlers might try to steal the cattle. Indians might attack. The cattle might decide to stampede for no particular reason. If you're the unlucky cowboy chosen for night watch, you don't get to sleep at all. You get to ride around the herd in the dark, trying to keep thousands of animals calm and grouped together. Cowboys developed their own special sleeping skills. They could sleep in the saddle while riding. They could sleep standing up while on watch duty. They could sleep through thunderstorms, gunfights, and cattle stampedes. But their real skill was strategic napping. Since they never got a full night's sleep, they learned to grab 20-minute naps whenever possible, while the cattle were drinking at a stream, during meal breaks, even while riding if the horse was well trained enough. If you think cowboys had it bad, wait until you hear about the miners. Mining camps were like frontier towns, but concentrated into an area the size of a city block and populated entirely by men who spent their days underground digging for gold, silver, or whatever mineral was going to make them rich enough to get out of there. The sleeping arrangements in mining camps defied all logic and several laws of physics. Picture a bunkhouse that's essentially a wooden box, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, housing anywhere from 50 to 100 miners. These weren't beds, they were shelves. Literally. The miners built wooden shelves along the walls, stacked 3 or 4 high, with just enough space between levels for a human body. If you were on the top shelf and sat up too quickly, you'd knock yourself unconscious on the ceiling. Each bed was about 6 feet long and maybe 18 inches wide. That's smaller than a modern coffin and considerably less comfortable. Your mattress was a canvas sack filled with whatever you could find. Straw, if you were lucky, pine needles if you weren't, your own dirty clothes if you were desperate. The miners worked different shifts, which meant someone was always coming or going. The day shift would stumble in, covered in mud and rock dust, just as the night shift was trying to sleep. They'd bang around, curse, and generally make enough noise to wake the dead. And let's talk about that rock dust. Everything in a mining camp was covered in a fine layer of grit that got into your eyes, your mouth, your blankets, and places that dust has no business being. You'd go to sleep clean, well, relatively clean, and wake up looking like you'd been buried alive. The air in these bunkhouses was so thick with dust, tobacco smoke, and human funk that it was practically solid. Breathing was less of an automatic function and more of a conscious effort. Some miners would wet bandanas and tie them over their faces just to filter out the worst of it. Now, we can't talk about frontier sleeping without mentioning the saloon girls, because their situation was unique in ways that would make your modern sensibilities recoil in horror. These weren't just women who worked in saloons. Many of them lived there too. Their rooms were usually tiny spaces above the saloon, separated by thin wooden walls that provided about as much privacy as a cardboard box. The noise from downstairs never stopped. Pianos playing off-key, drunks singing, fights breaking out, and the general chaos of frontier nightlife continued until dawn. Then it started all over again. The women had to sleep during the day when it was hot, noisy, and bright, then work all night when they should have been sleeping. It was like being permanently jet-lagged, except there were no jets and no lag, just constant exhaustion. Their beds were usually the same ones they worked in, which created its own set of hygiene challenges. The sheets, when there were sheets, might be changed once a week if they were lucky. More often, they'd just flip the mattress and hope for the best. Many saloon girls slept in shifts, sharing rooms and beds with other women in the same profession. They'd develop complex schedules where some worked early evening while others slept, then they'd switch. The really successful saloon girls might eventually earn enough to rent their own tiny room, but even then, they were usually still living in the same building as their workplace, subject to the same noise, the same clientele, and the same general atmosphere of chaos. Frontier families had their own special challenges when it came to sleeping arrangements, and privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. A typical frontier family, let's say parents plus 4 or 5 kids, might live in a one-room cabin. One room, for everyone, all the time. The parents got the only real bed, which was usually a rope frame with a straw mattress. The kids slept wherever they could fit, on the floor, on benches, in the loft if there was one, or crowded together on a smaller bed if the family was prosperous enough to afford 2 pieces of furniture. There were no separate bedrooms, no privacy, no personal space. Everyone went to bed at the same time and got up at the same time. If someone was sick, everyone was exposed. If someone snored, everyone heard it. If someone had nightmares, everyone woke up. Parents had to be creative about intimate moments, which usually meant waiting until the children were asleep and hoping nobody woke up at an inconvenient time. This led to families with very specific bedtime routines and children who learned to sleep very soundly. Winter was especially challenging because the entire family would pile together for warmth. The family bed might contain 7 or 8 people, all pressed together under every blanket and piece of clothing they owned. Children grew up with absolutely no concept of personal space or privacy. Sharing beds with siblings was normal until marriage, and sometimes even after. Privacy was a luxury that most frontier families simply couldn't afford. If you were wealthy enough, and by wealthy, I mean you had more than 50 cents in your pocket, you might spring for a hotel instead of a boarding house. Don't get excited. Frontier hotels were just boarding houses with delusions of grandeur. The major difference was that hotels charged more money for essentially the same experience. You might get a slightly smaller room, only 10 people instead of 20, and the bed might have an actual mattress instead of a sack of straw. But the bugs were just as hungry, the smell was just as overwhelming, and your bunkmates were just as questionable. The only real advantage was that hotel proprietors sometimes provided a pitcher of semi-clean water for washing. The finest hotels might even offer private rooms, which meant you only had to share with one stranger instead of 19. This was considered the height of luxury, even though your private room was usually about the size of a modern closet and separated from the next room by walls so thin you could hear everything happening next door. And I do mean everything. Conversations, arguments, romantic encounters, and bodily functions were all part of the hotel experience. You'd know more about your neighbors than you ever wanted to know about anyone. The really upscale hotels might have carpets, which sounds nice until you realize that frontier carpets were never cleaned. They were just repositories for decades of spilled drinks, tobacco juice, and substances that defied identification. Walking on them was like stepping on a sponge made of decomposed organic matter. But perhaps the most miserable sleeping situation of all was trying to sleep while traveling by stagecoach. Imagine being locked in a wooden box with 8 other people, bouncing down roads that weren't really roads, but more like suggestions of where a road might someday be built. You're being thrown around like popcorn in a kettle, and this continues for days at a time. Your fellow passengers might include anyone from traveling salesmen to wanted criminals to people who were quite possibly insane. There were no background checks for stagecoach travel. If you had the fare, you got a seat. The stagecoach ran day and night, which meant you had to sleep sitting up, pressed against strangers, while being violently shaken every few seconds. Some people tried to sleep leaning against the windows, but the windows were usually open. No glass, remember, so you'd wake up covered in dust and possibly with a sunburn. The drivers changed every few hours, but the passengers were stuck for the entire journey. You'd get to know these people better than your own family, whether you wanted to or not. You'd learn about their personal habits, their medical conditions, and their opinions on everything from politics to proper stagecoach etiquette. Stagecoaches stopped every 12 to 15 hours at way stations, where you could get out, stretch your legs, and use the facilities. The facilities, by the way, were usually just a bush behind the station. Privacy was whatever you could create with your coat and a prayer. If you were really unlucky, the stagecoach might break down in the middle of nowhere, and then you'd be sleeping on the ground under the stars, hoping that the wolves were more afraid of you than you were of them. The arrival of the railroad changed everything about frontier travel, but sleeping on trains in the 1870s was its own special form of torture. Early passenger trains had hard wooden seats that were designed by someone who clearly hated the human spine. You sat bolt upright for hours at a time, and when night came, you just stayed sitting. There were no sleeping cars for regular passengers. Those were reserved for the wealthy elite. The train cars were lit by oil lamps that created a dim, flickering light and filled the air with smoke and fumes. The windows were open for ventilation, which meant you were constantly covered in soot, ash, and sparks from the engine. Your fellow passengers were the same mix of humanity you'd find anywhere on the frontier, unwashed, exhausted, and probably carrying weapons. But now you were all locked together in a moving metal tube, swaying back and forth at 30 miles per hour. The noise was incredible. The engine, the wheels on the tracks, the whistle blowing every few minutes, and the general creaking and groaning of a machine that sounded like it was held together with prayers and hope. People tried to sleep by leaning on each other, which led to some awkward situations when strangers woke up to find themselves essentially cuddling with someone they'd never met. There was no protocol for this. You just pretended it hadn't happened and tried not to make eye contact. The really enterprising passengers would stretch out on the floor, but the floor was filthy and vibrating constantly. Plus, you risked being stepped on by other passengers, making their way to the extremely primitive bathroom facilities. If you were heading west in a covered wagon, your sleeping arrangements depended entirely on your preparation and luck. Smart families brought feather beds, blankets, and canvas tarps. Dumb families brought nothing and hoped for the best. Inside a covered wagon, you had maybe 6 feet by 10 feet of space for an entire family plus all their possessions. During the day, the space was packed with furniture, food, tools, and supplies. At night, you had to rearrange everything to create sleeping space. The wagon bed was hard wood with no cushioning. Some families brought mattresses, but many just slept on the bare boards with a blanket between them and the wood. It was like sleeping on a park bench, except the park bench was moving and occasionally falling off cliffs. The canvas top provided some protection from rain, but it wasn't waterproof. In a storm, you'd be lying in puddles while trying to keep your bedding dry. The wind would whip the canvas around, creating a constant snapping sound that made sleep nearly impossible. Outside, the wagon wasn't much better. The ground was hard, rocky, and home to various creatures that were interested in sharing your sleeping space. Snakes were particularly fond of crawling into warm bedrolls with unsuspecting humans. Indian attacks were a real possibility, which meant someone had to stay awake on guard duty every night. The guards would wake everyone at the first sign of trouble, which might be a legitimate threat or might be a rabbit stepping on a twig. Weather was always a factor. Too hot during the day, too cold at night, sudden storms that would soak everything you owned, and wind that never seemed to stop blowing dust into every crevice of your body. Soldiers stationed at frontier forts had their own unique sleeping challenges. Military discipline meant everyone went to bed at the same time and got up at the same time, but it didn't make the accommodations any more comfortable. A typical barracks housed 20 to 30 soldiers in a space designed for maybe 15. The beds were wooden bunks with straw mattresses and wool blankets that had been used by previous soldiers and never properly cleaned. Everything in the barracks was communal: the beds, the blankets, the wash basin, and the chamber pot. Privacy was non-existent, and personal hygiene was a group activity whether you wanted it to be or not. The soldiers came from all walks of life and all levels of society, which meant you might be sleeping next to a former bank president or a man who'd never learned to read. Education levels varied wildly, but the smell was universally terrible. Military discipline required absolute silence after lights out, but this was enforced by sergeants who were often just as tired and cranky as everyone else. The punishment for talking after bedtime might be extra guard duty, which meant even less sleep the next night. Fort walls provided protection from Indian attacks, but they also trapped heat in summer and cold in winter. The barracks were often the most miserable buildings on the entire frontier, which is saying something. One thing that made frontier sleeping even more complicated was the fact that people were constantly moving. Cowboys followed cattle herds, miners chased new strikes, and settlers kept pushing further west in search of better land. This meant that just as you got used to one horrible sleeping situation, you'd have to pack up and find a new horrible sleeping situation somewhere else. There was no time to get comfortable or establish routines. You were always adapting to new challenges. The timing of these moves was often dictated by weather and seasons. Cattle drives happened in spring and summer when the grass was good. Mining camps were often abandoned in winter when the weather made work impossible. Settlers tried to time their moves to arrive at their destination before winter set in. This constant movement meant that people became experts at sleeping anywhere, under any conditions. They had to be adaptable, resourceful, and tough enough to handle whatever circumstances they found themselves in. The most successful frontiersmen were those who could fall asleep quickly, sleep lightly enough to wake up if there was danger, and function on very little rest. These weren't just useful skills, they were survival skills. All of this sleeping rough had serious health consequences that people just accepted as part of frontier life. Chronic sleep deprivation was normal. Most people were exhausted most of the time, which affected their judgment, their reflexes, and their overall health. The constant exposure to bugs and unsanitary conditions led to diseases that are almost unknown today. Typhus, carried by lice, was common. Dysentery from contaminated water and poor sanitation killed more people than Indian attacks. Respiratory diseases from breathing dust and smoke were epidemic. Malnutrition made everything worse. People weren't getting enough vitamins, protein, or calories to support their demanding lifestyle. This made them more susceptible to disease and less able to recover from illness or injury. Mental health was another major issue, though it wasn't recognized as such at the time. The stress of frontier life, combined with chronic sleep deprivation and social isolation, led to what we might now recognize as depression and anxiety. Many frontiersmen dealt with these problems by self-medicating with alcohol, which only made the sleeping problems worse. Drunk people don't sleep well, they snore more, and they're more likely to cause problems for their bunkmates. The women faced additional health challenges related to pregnancy and childbirth in unsanitary conditions. Having a baby on the frontier was dangerous under the best circumstances, and sleep deprivation made everything more difficult. Despite all these challenges, people not only survived but actually developed sophisticated strategies for making frontier sleeping bearable. These weren't written down in any manual. They were passed along through experience and word of mouth. The first rule was to never get too attached to comfort. If you expected to be miserable, you'd rarely be disappointed. If you hoped for a good night's sleep, you'd be constantly frustrated. Experienced frontiersmen learned to sleep in short bursts whenever possible. A 20-minute nap while the horses were resting was better than no sleep at all. They developed the ability to fall asleep instantly and wake up alert. They also learned to prioritize. Staying warm and dry was more important than being comfortable. Being safe was more important than being clean. Survival trumped everything else. Personal hygiene became a strategic decision rather than a daily routine. You washed when you could, but you didn't waste time or resources on it when there were more pressing concerns. Food and water were carefully managed. You ate what was available and saved the good stuff for when you really needed it. You drank water when you could find it, even if it wasn't particularly clean. Social skills became crucial for survival. The ability to get along with difficult people in close quarters could mean the difference between a miserable experience and a deadly one. Frontier sleeping was often a group activity, and groups that worked together slept better than groups that fought. Women developed their own specialized survival strategies that were different from men's approaches. They had to deal with additional challenges related to modesty, safety, and social expectations. Women traveling alone, which was rare but not unheard of, often disguised themselves as men to access better sleeping accommodations. It was dangerous, but sometimes it was the only way to get a bed that wasn't in a brothel. Women traveling with families became expert at creating privacy and comfort in impossible situations. They could set up sleeping areas that provided some semblance of modesty, even in one-room cabins or covered wagons. They developed techniques for managing hygiene and monthly cycles without proper facilities or privacy. This required planning, improvisation, and a level of resourcefulness that would impress modern survival experts. Women also became skilled at managing group dynamics. In crowded sleeping situations, they often took on the role of peacekeepers, mediating disputes and establishing rules that made communal living bearable. Many women kept detailed diaries of their frontier experiences, and these provide some of our best insights into what daily life was really like. They wrote about the challenges of maintaining dignity in undignified circumstances and their strategies for staying sane in insane situations. Children adapted to frontier sleeping conditions in ways that amazed and sometimes horrified adults. They could sleep through noise that would keep adults awake, and they seemed immune to discomfort that would cripple grown men. Kids developed their own social hierarchies around sleeping arrangements. The biggest or oldest children got the best spots, while the smallest were often stuck with whatever was left. This taught valuable lessons about negotiation and resource management. Children became expert at finding safe, comfortable sleeping spots in impossible situations. They could curl up in spaces adults couldn't fit into, and they had an uncanny ability to find the warmest, quietest corners of any room. They also developed remarkable tolerance for bugs and dirt. Adult frontiersmen would spend hours trying to get comfortable, while children would simply curl up wherever they were and fall asleep instantly. Many frontier children grew up thinking that sharing beds with strangers was normal, that bugs were just part of life, and that privacy was something only rich people had. When they eventually moved to more civilized areas, they often had trouble adjusting to modern sleeping arrangements. Behind all of these sleeping horrors was a simple economic reality. Most people couldn't afford better accommodations. A bed in a boarding house cost about a day's wages for many workers. A private room was completely out of reach for anyone but the wealthy. This meant that sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort, they were about survival. People made choices based on what they could afford, and what they could afford was usually the cheapest option available. The boarding house owners knew they had a captive market. People needed somewhere to sleep, and there were limited options. This led to a race to the bottom in terms of quality and comfort. As long as people would pay for terrible accommodations, there was no incentive to improve them. Some entrepreneurs tried to create better sleeping options, but they usually failed because people couldn't afford to pay more for comfort. The market was driven by necessity, not preference. This economic pressure also meant that people became very creative about finding free or cheap sleeping options. Sleeping outdoors, sharing costs with strangers, and bartering for accommodations became common survival strategies. Frontier sleeping arrangements created unique social dynamics that would be impossible to replicate today. When you're sharing a bed with a stranger every night, you learn things about human nature that most people never discover. Trust became a complicated calculation. You had to trust your bunkmate not to rob you while you slept, but you also had to assume that everyone else was potentially dangerous. This led to a culture of cautious cooperation. Reputation was everything in frontier communities, and your sleeping behavior was part of your reputation. If you were known as someone who snored, kicked, or talked in your sleep, you might have trouble finding people willing to share accommodations with you. Social hierarchies developed around sleeping arrangements. The best beds went to the most respected or feared members of the community. Everyone else had to make do with whatever was left. These arrangements also created opportunities for unlikely friendships. People who might never have spoken to each other under normal circumstances became close companions after sharing sleeping space for weeks or months. Conflicts over sleeping arrangements could escalate quickly into violence. Arguments about who got which bed, or disputes about nighttime behavior, sometimes led to fights that ended in serious injury or death. As the frontier developed, people tried to come up with technological solutions to sleeping problems. These solutions were usually more creative than effective, but they showed the ingenuity of people desperate for a good night's sleep. Some boarding houses experimented with hammock hotels, where guests slept in hammocks instead of beds. This supposedly reduced the bedbug problem, but it created new problems with balance and comfort. Others tried rotating beds, where the mattresses could be flipped and rotated to distribute wear and supposedly reduce bugs. This worked about as well as you'd expect, which is to say not at all. There were attempts to create bug-proof beds using various chemicals and construction techniques. These usually involved some combination of kerosene, sulfur, and wishful thinking. They were often more dangerous than the bugs they were supposed to eliminate. Some entrepreneurs invented portable sleeping systems for travelers. These were usually contraptions involving canvas, rope, and metal frames that were supposed to provide clean, comfortable sleeping wherever you went. They were heavy, complicated, and usually broke down after a few uses. The most successful technological solution was actually quite simple: better transportation. As railroads expanded and travel became faster, people didn't have to spend as many nights in frontier accommodations. This reduced the market for terrible sleeping arrangements and eventually led to improvements in quality. Frontier sleeping arrangements created unique law enforcement challenges. When you have dozens of armed, exhausted, often drunk men sleeping in close quarters, conflicts are inevitable. Many frontier towns had specific laws about sleeping arrangements. Some required boarding houses to provide separate sleeping areas for different social classes. Others had regulations about maximum occupancy or minimum sanitation standards. Enforcement was usually impossible. Towns might have one sheriff for hundreds of square miles, and he had bigger problems to worry about than overcrowded boarding houses. Unless someone was actually killed, sleeping-related disputes were usually handled informally. This led to a culture of self-policing, where the guests themselves established and enforced rules about behavior. These informal codes could be more strict and more brutally enforced than any official law. Violence over sleeping arrangements was common enough that many frontier newspapers regularly reported on bunk fights and bedtime shootings. These were considered minor local news, not major crimes. Some boarding houses hired their own security, usually tough men who could break up fights and evict troublemakers. These housemen often had more real authority than official law enforcement. Frontier sleeping conditions created medical problems that doctors of the time couldn't understand or treat effectively. The combination of poor sanitation, overcrowding, and exhaustion led to diseases that spread rapidly through sleeping communities. Bunkhouse fever was a common diagnosis that covered everything from typhus to pneumonia to food poisoning. Doctors knew it was related to sleeping conditions, but they didn't understand the mechanisms of disease transmission. Skin conditions were epidemic. Between the bugs, the dirt, and the constant contact with unwashed clothing and bedding, most frontiersmen developed rashes, sores, and infections that never properly healed. Respiratory problems were universal. The combination of dust, smoke, poor air circulation, and close contact with sick people meant that everyone was always coughing, wheezing, or fighting off some kind of lung infection. Mental health issues were common but not recognized as medical problems. What we might now diagnose as depression, anxiety, or PTSD was usually dismissed as weakness or bad character. The medical treatments of the time often made things worse. Mercury-based medicines, bloodletting, and other cures weakened people's immune systems and made them more susceptible to disease. Despite all the misery, frontier sleeping arrangements created opportunities for entrepreneurial people to make money. Some of these businesses were legitimate improvements, while others were just new ways to separate desperate people from their money. Sleep doctors sold patent medicines that supposedly helped people sleep better in difficult conditions. These were usually alcohol-based tonics that did more harm than good, but they were popular with people who were desperate for any solution. Comfort specialists sold everything from special pillows to bug-proof blankets to portable bed frames. Most of these products were overpriced and ineffective, but the market for them was huge. Some entrepreneurs established luxury camps that provided better sleeping accommodations for wealthy travelers. These were usually just regular accommodations with higher prices and fancier names. The most successful sleep-related businesses were actually quite simple: laundry services and bathhouses. People were willing to pay premium prices for clean clothes and the opportunity to wash off the accumulated grime of frontier life. Some of the most successful frontier businesses were built on solving sleep-related problems. Companies that manufactured better mattresses, cleaner bedding, or more effective pest control products could make fortunes if they could figure out how to produce and distribute their products in frontier conditions. The experience of frontier sleeping left a permanent mark on American culture that we can still see today. The idea that luxury and comfort are something to be earned rather than expected comes directly from this experience. Many families passed down sleeping-related traditions and superstitions that originated on the frontier. The practice of checking for bugs before getting into bed, sleeping with one ear open, and always having an escape plan are all frontier sleeping skills that became cultural habits. The American obsession with self-reliance and independence can be traced partly to frontier sleeping experiences. When you've learned to sleep anywhere, under any conditions, without depending on anyone else for comfort or safety, you develop a different relationship with the world. Frontier sleeping also created a unique American tolerance for temporary discomfort in pursuit of long-term goals. The ability to endure terrible conditions while working towards something better became a defining characteristic of American culture. Many of the social skills that Americans are known for, the ability to get along with strangers, to make the best of bad situations, and to maintain optimism in the face of adversity, were developed in frontier sleeping quarters. By the 1880s, things were starting to improve. The expansion of railroads meant that more goods could be transported to frontier towns, including better bedding, building materials, and even glass for windows. Telegraph communication meant that information about better practices could spread more quickly. If someone in California developed a better way to deal with bedbugs, people in Kansas might hear about it within weeks instead of years. The growth of established towns created competition for sleeping accommodations. When there were multiple boarding houses in a town, they had to compete for customers, which led to gradual improvements in quality. Increased prosperity meant that more people could afford better accommodations. As the frontier economy developed, more people had the money to pay for privacy and comfort. New technologies, like better lighting and heating systems, made it possible to create more comfortable sleeping environments without enormous expense. Government regulation also played a role. As territories became states, they established health and safety codes that, while minimal by modern standards, were still improvements over the complete lack of oversight that characterized early frontier accommodations. Looking back at frontier sleeping habits, we can see how human beings adapt to impossible circumstances through ingenuity, cooperation, and sheer determination. The people who survived and thrived on the frontier were those who could find solutions to problems that would defeat most modern people. They learned that comfort is relative, and that the human body and spirit are capable of adapting to conditions that seem unbearable. They discovered that social cooperation is essential for survival, and that individual comfort sometimes has to be sacrificed for group survival. They developed skills that we've largely lost in our modern world: the ability to sleep anywhere, to get along with difficult people in close quarters, to maintain hygiene and dignity in undignified circumstances, and to find humor and hope in hopeless situations. They also learned the true value of simple comforts that we take for granted: a clean bed, a private room, a quiet night's sleep, and the luxury of being able to choose your sleeping companions. Most importantly, they proved that human beings are capable of enduring and overcoming conditions that seem impossible. The frontier sleeping experience was a testament to human resilience, adaptability, and the power of the human spirit to find ways to survive and even thrive in the face of overwhelming challenges. So, what does all this mean for us today? Well, the next time you're lying in your climate-controlled bedroom on your comfortable mattress with your clean sheets and your privacy, You might want to spare a thought for your frontier ancestors who would have considered your sleeping arrangements the height of unimaginable luxury. When you complain about your neighbor's music being too loud, remember the cowboy who had to sleep next to a man who hadn't washed in 3 months and snored like a freight train. When you're annoyed about having to share a hotel room with a friend, think about the frontier travelers who shared beds with complete strangers every night for months at a time. When you're worried about bedbugs in a hotel, remember that frontier bedbugs were the size of your thumb and traveled in armies. The truth is, most of us have never experienced real discomfort, let alone the kind of sleeping conditions that were normal for our ancestors. We've become soft in ways that would have been incomprehensible to people who lived just 150 years ago. But there's also something to be said for the fact that we've solved these problems. We've created a world where everyone can expect basic comfort and privacy. We've eliminated most of the diseases that plagued frontier sleepers. We've made it possible for people to travel long distances without having to endure weeks of miserable accommodations. As I wrap up this deep dive into the weird, wild, and wonderfully disgusting world of frontier sleep habits, I want you to think about what we've learned together tonight. We've seen how people adapted to impossible circumstances through creativity, cooperation, and sheer bloody-minded determination. We've discovered that comfort is a luxury that most of human history has done without, and that the things we consider basic necessities were unimaginable luxuries to our ancestors. We've learned that humans are capable of adapting to conditions that would seem impossible to endure, and that community and cooperation can make even the worst situations bearable. We've also seen how economic necessity shapes living conditions, and how improvements in technology and prosperity can gradually make life better for everyone. But perhaps most importantly, we've gained some perspective on our own lives. The problems we face today, stress, insomnia, noisy neighbors, uncomfortable mattresses, pale in comparison to what previous generations dealt with as a matter of course. This doesn't mean our problems aren't real or important. It just means we might want to appreciate what we have while we're working to make things even better. So tonight, when you climb into your comfortable bed in your quiet room, take a moment to appreciate the amazing luxury of your situation. You're experiencing a level of comfort that would have been unimaginable to 99% of all the humans who have ever lived. And maybe, just maybe, you'll sleep a little better knowing that whatever problems you have, at least you don't have to share your bed with a stranger who hasn't washed since the Grant administration. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, if you enjoyed this journey into the strange world of frontier sleeping, hit that like button, subscribe for more historical deep dives, and let me know in the comments what other aspects of frontier life you'd like to explore. Until next time, this is Rusty Historian, reminding you that history is always weirder, grosser, and more fascinating than you thought it was. Now go enjoy your bug-free, climate-controlled private bedroom. You've earned it just by being born in the right century. But let me tell you about another group that had their own unique sleeping nightmares. The traveling doctors and medicine show performers. These folks were constantly on the move, peddling dubious cures and putting on shows in frontier towns that barely qualified as settlements. Picture Dr. Elijah Hawthorne's miraculous medical emporium rolling into town. It's basically a wagon painted in colors that would make a circus jealous, covered in claims about curing everything from baldness to moral decay. Dr. Hawthorne himself, who probably learned medicine from a book he found in a saloon, needs somewhere to sleep. The doctor and his troupe of performers would often sleep right in their wagons, which were cramped beyond belief. Imagine trying to sleep in a space the size of a modern walk-in closet, except it's filled with bottles of miracle elixir, which was mostly alcohol and sugar, medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a torture museum, and costumes for the evening's entertainment. The wagon would be parked wherever the town allowed, which was usually next to the livery stable or behind the saloon. This meant spending the night listening to horses doing horse things, drunk cowboys singing off-key ballads, and the occasional gunfight over card games. Dr. Hawthorne himself would sleep on a narrow cot, surrounded by his medical supplies. The bottles would clink and rattle every time he moved, creating a constant symphony of glass-on-glass percussion. If the wagon was parked on uneven ground, which it always was, because frontier towns didn't believe in the concept of level surfaces, everything would slowly slide to one end during the night. The performers had it even worse. The strongman, the fire eater, and the woman who claimed she could communicate with spirits would sleep wherever they could find space. This might mean curled up between prop boxes, stretched out on bags of medicinal herbs, which were usually just weeds picked along the trail, or hanging in a hammock strung between the wagon wheels. The fire eater had the additional challenge of sleeping with severely burned lips and tongue from his nightly performances. Imagine trying to get comfortable when every position puts pressure on fresh burns, and your mouth tastes like a combination of kerosene and regret. The strongman, whose real name was probably something like Tiny Pete, and who got his muscles from years of hard labor rather than any special training, would often sleep sitting up because lying down made his back seize up from all the heavy lifting he did during shows. And the spirit medium? Well, she claimed she couldn't sleep at all because the ghosts wouldn't leave her alone. Whether this was true or just part of her act, she'd spend most nights walking around the wagon, muttering to invisible presences and occasionally shrieking about messages from the beyond. This, as you might imagine, didn't help anyone else get a good night's rest. Speaking of unique sleeping situations, let's talk about the railroad workers who were literally building the infrastructure that would eventually improve everyone else's sleeping conditions. These men had a sleeping situation that was part construction site, part military camp, and part traveling circus. The crews building the Transcontinental Railroad lived in work camps that moved along with the construction. Today you might be in Nebraska, next week you'd be in Wyoming, and the week after that you'd be camped on a mountainside in Colorado, wondering how you ended up sleeping at an altitude where the air was too thin to breathe properly. The railroad companies provided sleeping cars for their workers, but these weren't passenger cars. They were essentially mobile bunkhouses on wheels. Picture a train car with wooden shelves built along both walls, 3 levels high, each shelf barely wide enough for one man and his bedroll. The men working on the railroad came from all over the world. You'd have Irish immigrants sleeping next to Chinese workers, German craftsmen next to freed slaves, and Mexican laborers next to Civil War veterans who might have been shooting at each other just a few years earlier. Language barriers made communication difficult, but fortunately, snoring sounds the same in every language. The work was brutally hard, 12 to 14 hours a day of digging, hauling, and laying track in all weather conditions. The men would stumble into their sleeping car so exhausted they could barely stand, covered in dirt, sweat, and sometimes blood from the day's accidents. The sleeping cars had no windows, no ventilation, and certainly no privacy. In summer, they were ovens that trapped heat and humidity. In winter, they were ice boxes where your breath would freeze on your blanket. The cars were heated by small wood stoves that created more smoke than warmth and had a disturbing tendency to set things on fire. Food was cooked and eaten in the same cars where everyone slept. This meant the air was permanently filled with the smell of beans, salt pork, and whatever local game the camp hunters had managed to kill. Sometimes this was deer or antelope. Sometimes it was things that were better not identified too closely. The railroad moved constantly, which meant the sleeping cars were often in motion during the night. Trying to sleep while the cars swayed, bounced, and occasionally derailed was like trying to sleep during an earthquake that lasted for 8 hours. Men would wake up in completely different positions than they'd gone to sleep in, sometimes on the floor, sometimes wedged between their bunk and the wall. The Chinese workers, who made up a large portion of the workforce, had their own cultural practices around sleep and rest that clashed with American and European customs. They preferred different sleeping positions, different bedding materials, and different schedules for rest and work. This led to conflicts and misunderstandings that sometimes erupted into violence in the close quarters of the sleeping cars. Now let's talk about a group that redefined the entire concept of sleep, the Pony Express riders. These young men, and they were mostly teenagers and men in their early 20s, had to cover 2,000 miles of hostile territory in 10 days, changing horses every 10, 15 miles, and riders every 75, 100 miles. A Pony Express rider's sleep schedule was determined by the mail delivery timetable, not by human biological needs. You might ride for 18 hours straight, catch 4 hours of sleep at a relay station, then get back on a fresh horse for another marathon ride. This went on for weeks at a time. The relay stations where riders caught their brief rest periods were some of the most primitive accommodations on the entire frontier. They were usually one-room log cabins or adobe huts, built quickly and cheaply in the most desolate locations imaginable. The stations were placed for strategic purposes: water access, defensible positions, distance intervals, not for comfort. A typical relay station might house the station keeper, his family if he had one, spare horses, feed for the animals, supplies for the riders, and whatever wildlife had decided to move in. All of this in a space about the size of a modern studio apartment. The riders slept wherever they could find space, often sharing beds with other riders whose schedules overlapped. Sometimes this meant sleeping with someone who was just starting his run and was relatively clean, but more often it meant sleeping with someone who'd been riding for days and smelled like a combination of horse sweat, human sweat, leather, and trail dust. The beds were usually just blankets thrown over straw or pine boughs. Pillows were saddlebags or rolled-up clothing. Privacy was whatever you could create by hanging a blanket from the ceiling or turning your back to the room. Station keepers' wives, when there were any, tried to provide some basic hospitality, but resources were extremely limited. A hot meal was a luxury. Clean water was precious. A clean blanket was practically a miracle. The riders had to sleep with their guns within reach because Pony Express stations were frequent targets for Indian raids, outlaw attacks, and simple robbery attempts. The mail they carried was often valuable, and the horses were always valuable, making the stations attractive targets for anyone with questionable morals and flexible ethics. Sleep was often interrupted by the arrival of other riders, the need to change horses, or emergencies that required immediate attention. A rider might fall asleep exhausted at sunset and be awakened at midnight because his relief rider's horse had gone lame 50 miles away, and now he had to continue the run. The psychological stress of the job made sleep even more difficult. These young men were carrying mail across territory where death was a constant possibility. They rode alone through landscapes that could kill them in a dozen different ways, knowing that if something happened to them, their bodies might never be found. Many Pony Express riders developed chronic insomnia from the combination of irregular schedules, physical exhaustion, and constant stress. They'd be dead tired but unable to fall asleep because their bodies never knew when they'd be called upon to ride for their lives. Let's talk about the men who were supposed to keep order in this chaos: the sheriffs, marshals, and other lawmen of the frontier. Their sleeping arrangements were complicated by the fact that they had to be ready for trouble at any hour of the day or night. Sheriff Tom Bradley's office in Dodge City was typical of frontier law enforcement accommodations. During the day, it served as courthouse, jail, and office. At night, it became the sheriff's bedroom. Bradley slept on a cot in the corner, surrounded by wanted posters, legal documents, and enough weapons to arm a small militia. The jail cells were right next to the sheriff's sleeping area, separated by iron bars and about 3 feet of space. This meant that Sheriff Bradley's lullaby was usually a chorus of drunk cowboys, cattle thieves, and assorted criminals expressing their opinions about law enforcement, the justice system, and the sheriff's ancestry. Prisoners were often more drunk than criminal, which meant they spent the night vomiting, crying, singing, or trying to pick fights with each other through the bars. The smell was indescribable, a combination of alcohol, vomit, unwashed bodies, and fear sweat that no amount of fresh air could eliminate. Sheriff Bradley had to sleep with one ear open because trouble could start at any moment. A poker game gone wrong, a dispute over a woman, or a cattle rustling operation could turn deadly in seconds. The sheriff might be awakened by gunshots, screaming, or simply someone pounding on his door demanding immediate justice for some perceived wrong. The lawman's bed was positioned so he could see both the jail cells and the front door of his office. His gun belt hung on a peg within arm's reach. His boots were always positioned for quick access because there's nothing quite like trying to chase armed criminals through muddy streets while barefoot. Many frontier sheriffs were elected officials who had to maintain their own accommodations. The town might provide an office and jail, but the sheriff was responsible for his own food, clothing, and bedding. This led to some interesting economic arrangements where sheriffs supplemented their income by renting out jail space to drunk cowboys who needed a place to sleep it off. The rotation of prisoners meant that Sheriff Bradley never knew who he'd be sharing his sleeping space with on any given night. One night, it might be a harmless drunk who'd pass out and sleep quietly. The next night, it might be a hardened criminal who'd spend the evening making detailed threats about what he'd do to the sheriff when he got out of jail. Federal marshals had even more complicated sleeping arrangements because they traveled constantly across vast territories. A marshal might spend one night in a decent hotel in the established town, the next night camping under the stars while tracking outlaws, and the third night sleeping in a line shack with a family of homesteaders who were too poor to offer anything but floor space and grateful for any protection the law could provide. Professional gamblers had their own unique sleeping challenges that combined the worst aspects of frontier accommodations with the additional complications of their chosen profession. Riverboat, Johnny McCann, who'd never actually worked on a riverboat but liked the sound of it, was a traveling poker player who made his living in frontier saloons. His sleeping arrangements depended entirely on his luck at the card table and his ability to avoid getting shot by sore losers. When Johnny was winning, he could afford a room at the best hotel in town. When he was losing, he might end up sleeping in the saloon's back room with the other down-on-their-luck gamblers, drunks, and general ne'er-do-wells. Saloons never really closed, which meant there was always noise, activity, and the potential for violence. The back room where unsuccessful gamblers slept was usually right next to the main saloon floor, separated by thin walls that provided no sound insulation whatsoever. Professional gamblers wore expensive clothes as part of their image, but these same clothes made them targets for robbery. Johnny had to sleep with his money hidden in various locations on his body, some sewn into his coat lining, some in his boots, some in places that would make a TSA agent blush. This made sleeping extremely uncomfortable, but losing your stake to thieves was a career-ending event. The gambling profession attracted men who lived by their wits rather than their physical strength, but the frontier was a place where physical violence was always a possibility. Gamblers developed a reputation for being quick with guns and knives because they had to be able to defend themselves against much larger, stronger opponents who might not appreciate losing their money to someone they perceived as a city slicker. This meant that professional gamblers slept very lightly, with weapons close at hand, in accommodations where they never knew who might be sharing their sleeping space. Johnny might go to sleep next to a seemingly harmless cowboy and wake up to find out his bunkmate was actually a wanted outlaw who'd recognized Johnny from a previous encounter that hadn't ended well. The irregular income of professional gambling meant that a gambler's sleeping accommodations could change dramatically from night to night. Monday might find Johnny in silk sheets at the finest hotel in town, while Tuesday might see him sleeping on a pile of grain sacks in a warehouse, depending on how the cards had fallen. Gamblers also had to deal with the social stigma of their profession. Many respectable establishments wouldn't rent rooms to known gamblers, forcing them to seek accommodations in the seediest parts of already seedy frontier towns. This meant staying in places where violence was more common, sanitation was worse, and the clientele was more dangerous than the usual frontier standard. Religious figures on the frontier faced unique sleeping challenges that combined practical hardships with moral and social complications that would make modern church leaders weep. Reverend Josiah Whitmore traveled from town to town conducting revival meetings and trying to bring moral order to communities that seemed to specialize in sin. His sleeping arrangements were a constant test of his Christian charity and his ability to turn the other cheek. In established towns with actual churches, Reverend Whitmore might sleep in the vestry or in a small room attached to the church building. This sounds peaceful until you realize that frontier churches were also used as community centers, meeting halls, and sometimes as temporary shelters for anyone who needed them. The Reverend might go to sleep in his quiet church only to be awakened by a town meeting about water rights, a wedding celebration that had gotten out of hand, or a family of travelers who had been given permission to sleep in the pews until they could get back on their feet. In towns without established churches, the Reverend had to negotiate for sleeping space like everyone else. The moral authority of his position might get him slightly better treatment, but it also made him a target for people who had complicated relationships with religion and authority. Some townspeople would offer the preacher their best accommodations as a demonstration of their piety. Others would deliberately put him in the worst possible situations to test his faith and commitment. Reverend Whitmore never knew whether an invitation to stay with the family meant sleeping in a clean guest room or sharing a bed with 3 unwashed children and a dog. The preacher's moral obligations complicated his sleeping arrangements in ways that didn't affect other travelers. He couldn't share accommodations with women without causing scandal. He couldn't sleep in saloons or brothels without compromising his moral authority. He couldn't drink alcohol to help him sleep, couldn't gamble for better accommodations, and couldn't use physical intimidation to improve his situation. This left Reverend Whitmore with fewer options than most frontier travelers, often forcing him to accept whatever charitable accommodations were offered or sleep outdoors regardless of weather conditions. His moral standards were both his protection and his limitation. In a world where flexibility and compromise were often necessary for survival, circuit-riding preachers like Reverend Whitmore traveled hundreds of miles between communities, often sleeping outdoors for weeks at a time. They carried their own bedrolls, cooking equipment, and supplies, but they also had to transport Bibles, hymnals, and other religious materials that took up space and added weight to their already overburdened horses. The preacher's schedule was determined by the religious calendar and the needs of scattered communities, not by practical considerations like weather or available accommodations. Reverend Whitmore might have to travel through blizzards to reach a community for Christmas services, or cross flooded rivers to perform a funeral, regardless of the impact on his comfort or safety. Federal judges and circuit court officials had sleeping arrangements that were part traveling show, part military campaign, and part diplomatic mission. These men were responsible for bringing legal order to territories where the concept of law was still a work in progress. Judge Cornelius Blackwood traveled a circuit that covered roughly the same area as a modern state, holding court in whatever buildings were available and sleeping wherever he could negotiate accommodations. His arrival in a frontier town was often the biggest event of the year, combining the excitement of a circus with the drama of a public execution. The judge traveled with a small entourage that included a court clerk, a bailiff who also served as bodyguard, and sometimes a stenographer if the territory could afford such luxury. This group had to find accommodations together, which meant negotiating for multiple beds or rooms in communities where a single decent bed was considered a remarkable luxury. Judge Blackwood's position required him to maintain dignity and authority while sleeping in conditions that would challenge a hobo's standards of acceptability. He might hold court in the morning in a saloon that still smelled of the previous night's activities, then sleep that night in the same building, surrounded by the same smells and often the same clientele he'd been sentencing during the day. The judge's bedtime reading consisted of law books, case files, and legal correspondence that had to be protected from the elements, insects, and the general chaos of frontier life. Legal documents were precious on the frontier, representing the thin line between civilization and anarchy, but they were also bulky, heavy, and attractive to insects that seemed to consider legal paper a delicacy. Court sessions often ran late into the night because there was so much legal business to conduct and so little time to conduct it. Judge Blackwood might hold court from dawn to midnight, dealing with everything from claim disputes to murder trials, then have to wake up early to travel to the next town on his circuit. The judge's sleeping arrangements were complicated by security concerns. His decisions often made him enemies among the local population, and frontier justice sometimes extended to taking personal revenge against judges who handed down unpopular verdicts. Judge Blackwood had to sleep with weapons close at hand and often changed his sleeping location without notice to avoid potential assassination attempts. The legal system's need for documentation meant that Judge Blackwood traveled with trunk loads of paperwork that had to be kept dry, organized, and secure. This paperwork often took up most of the available space and whatever accommodations he could find, forcing him to sleep in increasingly creative arrangements that balanced legal necessity with physical comfort. Buffalo hunters lived a lifestyle that was part nomadic tribe, part military expedition, and part ecological disaster. Their sleeping arrangements followed the great herds across the plains, creating temporary camps that moved constantly and left environmental destruction in their wake. Buffalo Bill Henderson, not to be confused with the more famous Buffalo Bill, led a hunting outfit that followed the herds from Texas to Canada and back again, depending on the season and the animals' migration patterns. His camp was home to a dozen hunters, skinners, and general laborers who lived entirely off the land and the buffalo they killed. The hunting outfit traveled with heavy wagons loaded with supplies, ammunition, and the tools necessary to process buffalo carcasses into hides that could be sold in eastern markets. These same wagons served as mobile homes for the hunting party, with men sleeping under, in, and on top of the wagons, depending on weather conditions and personal preference. Buffalo hunting was messy, bloody work that left everyone involved covered in gore, grease, and the distinctive smell of death that seemed to permeate everything they owned. The hunters' sleeping arrangements reflected this reality. Bedrolls that were permanently stained with blood, clothes that could probably stand up by themselves, and an aroma that kept most wildlife at a respectful distance. The hunting camps were established near water sources when possible, but the buffalo herds didn't always cooperate with human convenience. Sometimes, the hunters would have to make dry camps miles from the nearest water, rationing what they could carry and hoping to find a stream or spring before their supplies ran out. Weather was always a factor in buffalo hunting because the work had to continue regardless of conditions. The hunters slept through thunderstorms, blizzards, and heat waves that would send modern people running for climate-controlled shelter. Their wagons provided some protection, but frontier wagon construction wasn't designed with comfort in mind. The buffalo hunters shared their camps with an ecosystem of scavengers, carrion eaters, and predators drawn by the constant availability of fresh meat and rotting carcasses. Wolves, coyotes, buzzards, and various insects created a constant chorus of sounds and smells that accompanied the hunters' attempts to sleep. The seasonal nature of buffalo hunting meant that the outfits had to be prepared for extreme variations in weather and sleeping conditions. Summer camps on the southern plains were furnaces where the heat was intense enough to cook meat without fire. Winter camps in Montana or North Dakota were survival exercises where a mistake in preparation could mean death from exposure. Frontier photographers faced unique sleeping challenges that combined the practical problems of traveling with delicate equipment with the chemical hazards of early photographic processes. Ezra Whitfield traveled the frontier with a wagon load of cameras, glass plates, chemicals, and the portable dark-room equipment necessary to process photographs in the middle of nowhere. His sleeping arrangements were dictated by the need to protect his expensive and fragile equipment while also avoiding the toxic fumes from his photographic chemicals. The photographic chemicals of the 1870s were seriously dangerous. Silver nitrate, mercury compounds, and various acids that could blind you, burn your skin, or poison you if handled improperly. Ezra had to sleep in the same wagon where he stored these chemicals, breathing fumes that probably took years off his life and definitely made restful sleep nearly impossible. Processing photographs required complete darkness, which meant Ezra often worked at night in his portable dark room, a canvas tent lined with black fabric that trapped heat and chemical fumes while he developed images by the light of a heavily filtered lantern. After hours of work in this environment, he'd emerge dizzy, nauseated, and reeking of chemicals that made him unwelcome in most sleeping accommodations. Frontier photography was a physically demanding profession that required traveling to remote locations with heavy equipment over rough terrain. Ezra's wagon was loaded with cameras that weighed 50 pounds each, boxes of glass plates that were both heavy and fragile, and chemical baths that sloshed and spilled over every bump in the road. The photographer's sleep schedule was determined by light conditions and weather patterns rather than human biological needs. The best times for outdoor photography were early morning and late afternoon, which meant Ezra often worked before dawn and after sunset, processing images during the middle of the day when the light was too harsh for good pictures. Frontier communities were fascinated by photography, but also suspicious of it. Some people believed that cameras could steal their souls, while others were convinced that photographers were government spies or confidence men. This meant that Ezra often had to negotiate carefully for sleeping accommodations, balancing curiosity about his profession with suspicion about his motives. The value of photographic equipment made it a target for theft, but its complexity made it worthless to most thieves. Ezra had to sleep with his equipment, guarding it from people who might steal it without understanding what they'd stolen. A camera worth hundreds of dollars to a photographer might be traded for a bottle of whiskey by a thief who didn't realize what he had. The documentary nature of frontier photography meant that Ezra often witnessed and recorded events that were dangerous, illegal, or controversial. He photographed public hangings, Indian conflicts, mining disasters, and other events that made him enemies among people who preferred that certain activities remain undocumented. Frontier teachers faced sleeping challenges that combined the social expectations of their profession with the practical realities of bringing education to communities that barely had the resources to support basic survival. Miss Sarah Caldwell traveled from town to town, establishing schools and communities that had never seen a professional teacher. Her sleeping arrangements were complicated by the social expectations surrounding single women, the limited resources of frontier communities, and the cultural conflicts between education and survival priorities. In established communities, the school teacher might be provided with a small room attached to the schoolhouse or board with a respectable family. But respectability was a relative concept on the frontier, and Miss Caldwell often found herself staying with families whose definition of proper behavior didn't match her own. The schoolhouse itself was often a multi-purpose building that served as church, meeting hall, social center, and sometimes temporary shelter for travelers. Miss Caldwell might spend her days teaching children to read and write, then spend her nights sharing the same space with revival meetings, town council sessions, or wedding celebrations. Frontier communities often couldn't afford to pay teachers in cash, instead providing room and board plus whatever additional compensation they could manage. This might include food, clothing, firewood, or services like laundry and mending. The quality and quantity of these provisions varied dramatically depending on the community's resources and priorities. The teacher's schedule was determined by agricultural seasons and weather patterns rather than traditional academic calendars. Children were needed for planting and harvest, which meant school sessions were irregular and often interrupted. Miss Caldwell had to be flexible with her sleeping arrangements because she never knew when school would be in session or when she'd need to find alternative accommodations. Social expectations required teachers to maintain moral authority and respectability, which limited their options for sleeping arrangements. Miss Caldwell couldn't stay in saloons, couldn't share accommodations with unmarried men, and had to be careful about her associations with anyone whose reputation might compromise her position. The educational mission often brought teachers into conflict with local customs and priorities. Some community members resented the time and resources devoted to education when basic survival was still a challenge. This tension could affect the teacher's welcome in the community and the quality of accommodations provided. Teaching materials were expensive and difficult to transport, but they were essential for education. Miss Caldwell traveled with books, slates, chalk, paper, and other supplies that had to be protected from the elements while also being accessible for daily use. Her sleeping arrangements had to accommodate both her personal needs and the storage and security of educational materials. Now, we need to address something that's been lurking in the background of all these frontier stories: the original inhabitants of this land and how westward expansion completely destroyed their traditional sleeping and living arrangements. When we talk about frontier sleeping conditions, we often forget that there were already people living here who had developed sophisticated, sustainable ways of life over thousands of years. Native American tribes had sleeping arrangements that were perfectly adapted to their environments, their cultures, and their needs. Then, European American expansion came along and systematically destroyed all of that. Take the Plains tribes, for example. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and other nomadic peoples had perfected the art of portable, comfortable living. A teepee wasn't just a tent. It was a sophisticated piece of engineering that could be assembled in minutes, provided excellent ventilation, was waterproof when properly maintained, and could house an entire family comfortably. Inside a teepee, sleeping arrangements followed strict cultural protocols. There were specific areas for different family members, guests, and sacred objects. The sleeping space was designed around the fire pit in the center, with buffalo robes and other bedding arranged to maximize warmth and comfort while respecting social hierarchies and taboos. But as white settlers pushed west, these traditional arrangements were systematically destroyed. Tribes were forced off their ancestral lands, often with little warning and no time to maintain their traditional lifestyle. The buffalo herds that provided materials for teepees, bedding, and clothing were slaughtered almost to extinction, not for food or even for economic reasons, but specifically to force Native Americans into dependency. Native American families who had lived comfortably in well-designed dwellings for generations suddenly found themselves crowded onto reservations, where they were expected to live in government-built structures that were completely unsuited to their needs, their culture, or even basic human comfort. The reservation system created some of the worst sleeping conditions in American history. Government-built housing was designed by bureaucrats in Washington who had never seen the Western territories and certainly had never asked Native Americans what they might need. These structures were often one-room cabins that were too small for extended families, poorly ventilated, inadequately heated, and built with materials that couldn't withstand local weather conditions. Imagine being part of a Lakota family that had lived in spacious, comfortable teepees with sophisticated social arrangements, suddenly forced to crowd into a 12-foot cabin with 10 other people. No privacy, no cultural appropriate space arrangements, no way to maintain traditional practices, and construction so poor that the building leaked, flooded, and fell apart within a few years. The cultural disruption was even worse than the physical discomfort. Traditional sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort. They were about maintaining social structures, spiritual practices, and cultural identity. When families were forced to abandon these practices, they lost much more than just a good night's sleep. Native American children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their religions, or maintain any connection to their cultural heritage. These schools had sleeping arrangements that were deliberately designed to break down tribal identity and force assimilation into white culture. At institutions like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, Native American children slept in military-style barracks where their traditional names were replaced with English names. Their hair was cut, their traditional clothing was destroyed, and they were punished for any attempt to maintain their cultural practices. The sleeping quarters at these schools were overcrowded, poorly heated, and designed more like prisons than homes. Children who came from cultures with sophisticated concepts of privacy, respect, and appropriate social arrangements were forced into institutional settings that violated every principle of their upbringing. Many of these children never saw their families again. They were kept at the schools for years, during which time their communities might be forced to relocate again, making it impossible for families to reunite. The psychological trauma of this separation, combined with the physical misery of institutional sleeping arrangements, created lasting damage that affected generations. The Chinese immigrants who came to work on the railroad and in mining operations faced unique sleeping challenges that combined racial discrimination with cultural differences and economic exploitation. Chinese workers were usually segregated from white workers, forced to create their own communities and sleeping arrangements with minimal resources, and no support from the larger society. In railroad camps, Chinese workers were often assigned the worst sleeping areas, the cars closest to the engine, meaning more noise and soot, the lowest bunks, meaning other people's dirt and bodily fluids falling on them, and the areas with the worst ventilation. But the Chinese workers brought their own cultural practices and survival strategies that were different from European American approaches. They preferred different foods, different medicines, different social arrangements, and different approaches to cleanliness and health maintenance. Chinese workers often slept in groups organized around family relationships, regional origins, or clan affiliations from their home provinces. These arrangements provided mutual support and cultural continuity, but they also created tension with other workers who didn't understand or respect these practices. The Chinese workers' sleeping areas often smelled different because they cooked different foods, used different medicines, and burned incense for religious purposes. This led to complaints from other workers, and sometimes to violence from people who saw these differences as threatening or disgusting. Chinese workers also had different concepts of privacy and appropriate sleeping arrangements. What seemed normal and comfortable to them might seem strange or inappropriate to others, leading to misunderstandings and conflicts in the close quarters of frontier accommodations. The language barrier made everything more difficult. Chinese workers couldn't communicate their needs, complaints, or preferences to English-speaking supervisors. They couldn't negotiate for better accommodations, couldn't report problems or abuses, and couldn't defend themselves against false accusations or unfair treatment. Many Chinese workers planned to return to China after earning enough money to support their families, so they were willing to endure terrible conditions as temporary sacrifices. But temporary often lasted for years or decades, and many never made it back home. They spent their entire lives in sleeping conditions that they had accepted as short-term hardships. The Chinese workers created their own support systems within these constraints. They shared resources, took care of sick members of their community, and maintained cultural practices as much as possible within the limitations of frontier life. But they did this without any support from the larger society, and often in the face of active hostility and discrimination. In mining camps, Chinese workers were often assigned to work abandoned claims or areas that white miners considered too dangerous or unprofitable. Their sleeping accommodations reflected this second-class status, the worst locations, the oldest buildings, the areas most prone to flooding, cave-ins, or other disasters. Mexican vaqueros, the original cowboys who taught Anglo settlers most of what they knew about cattle handling, had their own sleeping traditions that reflected centuries of experience with ranch life in harsh environments. The vaqueros brought sophisticated leather-working skills, horseback riding techniques, and animal husbandry knowledge that were essential to the development of the American cattle industry. But they also brought cultural practices around sleeping, eating, and social organization that often clashed with Anglo-American expectations. Mexican ranch culture included concepts of hospitality, family loyalty, and community responsibility that influenced sleeping arrangements. Vaqueros were used to extended family groups sharing sleeping spaces with complex social hierarchies that determined who slept where and with whom. When Mexican vaqueros worked on Anglo-owned ranches, they often found themselves caught between their own cultural practices and the expectations of their employers. They might prefer to sleep in groups for social and security reasons, but be assigned individual sleeping spaces that isolated them from their cultural support systems. The vaqueros' sleeping equipment was often more sophisticated than what Anglo cowboys used. Mexican leatherworkers had developed specialized bedrolls, saddle designs, and camping equipment that were better adapted to southwestern conditions than the gear that settlers brought from the eastern United States. But these cultural differences sometimes led to conflict and misunderstanding. What the vaqueros saw as efficient and comfortable sleeping arrangements might be viewed by Anglo supervisors as lazy or inappropriate. The vaqueros' social practices around shared meals, group sleeping, and communal decision-making might be seen as threatening to the individual-focused culture of Anglo settlement. Mexican vaqueros also had different relationships with the landscape and environment. They understood seasonal patterns, water sources, and weather signs that were essential for successful cattle ranching in arid environments. Their sleeping arrangements were often chosen based on this environmental knowledge rather than simple convenience. The vaqueros' musical traditions, religious practices, and storytelling customs were all part of their sleeping and camp life. These cultural activities helped maintain group cohesion and individual morale during long cattle drives and isolated ranch work. But they also made their camps sound and look different from Anglo cowboy camps, sometimes leading to suspicion or hostility. As the cattle industry developed and Anglo ranchers took control of most operations, many vaquero traditions were adopted, but their origins were forgotten or deliberately obscured. The sleeping practices, equipment designs, and camp organization methods that had been developed over centuries by Mexican ranchers became part of American cowboy culture without acknowledgement of their sources. The African American cavalry units known as Buffalo Soldiers faced unique sleeping challenges that combined standard military hardships with the additional burdens of racial segregation and discrimination. These units were assigned to some of the most difficult and dangerous postings on the frontier, remote forts in harsh environments, where they were expected to maintain military discipline while dealing with equipment shortages, inadequate supplies, and often hostile reactions from the white civilians they were sent to protect. The Buffalo Soldiers' sleeping quarters were typically the worst facilities available at any given post. While white units might get newer barracks, better heating systems, and priority for repairs and maintenance, the African American units were often housed in older buildings that had been condemned for white soldiers. But the Buffalo Soldiers brought their own cultural resources and survival strategies that helped them endure these conditions. Many had been born into slavery or had served in the Civil War, giving them experience with hardship and deprivation that prepared them for frontier military life. The African American soldiers developed strong unit cohesion and mutual support systems that helped them deal with both the physical hardships of frontier military life and the psychological stress of serving in a segregated army. Their sleeping quarters became spaces where they could maintain their own cultural practices and support each other against external hostility. Music, storytelling, and religious practices were important parts of Buffalo Soldier camp life. These activities took place in and around their sleeping areas, creating a sense of community and cultural continuity despite the harsh conditions and social isolation they faced. The Buffalo Soldiers also had to deal with the complex racial dynamics of frontier communities. They might be welcomed by some groups while facing hostility from others, creating security concerns that affected where and how they could sleep when away from their home bases. Many Native American tribes respected the fighting abilities of the Buffalo Soldiers and developed complex relationships with these units that combined military conflict with mutual recognition of shared experiences with discrimination and displacement. These relationships sometimes affected sleeping arrangements during truces, negotiations, or winter camps. The Buffalo Soldiers' sleeping equipment and personal possessions reflected their military status and economic limitations. They were issued standard military gear that was often worn out or inadequate, but they also had to purchase additional items with their limited pay to make their sleeping situations bearable. Despite facing discrimination from their own army and hostility from many white civilians, the Buffalo Soldiers maintained high standards of military discipline and performance. Their sleeping quarters were kept in better order than those of many white units, reflecting both military pride and the knowledge that they would be judged more harshly for any shortcomings. Frontier doctors and surgeons faced sleeping challenges that were complicated by their professional responsibilities, the primitive state of medical knowledge, and the constant exposure to diseases and injuries that could be fatal in an era before antibiotics or modern surgical techniques. Dr. Marcus Whitman traveled throughout the Oregon Territory, treating everything from gunshot wounds to childbirth complications to diseases that wouldn't be properly understood for decades. His sleeping arrangements were dictated by medical emergencies that could happen at any time, often in locations far from any proper medical facilities. Frontier doctors had to carry their medical supplies with them, which meant their sleeping spaces were also storage areas for medicines, surgical instruments, and medical books. These supplies were valuable and needed to be protected, but they also included dangerous chemicals and sharp instruments that made sleeping arrangements more complex. Medical practice in the 1870s involved a lot of guesswork and treatments that were often more dangerous than the original conditions. Doctors used mercury, arsenic, and other toxic substances as medicines, performed surgery without understanding infection control, and relied on medical theories that were often completely wrong. This meant that frontier doctors were constantly exposed to diseases, toxic chemicals, and the psychological stress of treating patients they couldn't really help. Their sleeping quarters often reeked of medicinal chemicals and were contaminated with substances that would be considered hazardous waste by modern standards. Frontier doctors also dealt with the social pressure of being expected to have solutions for problems that were beyond the medical knowledge of the time. They were called upon to treat everything from broken bones to mental illness to epidemic diseases, often with nothing more than guesswork and hope. The irregular schedule of medical emergencies meant that doctors rarely got uninterrupted sleep. Dr. Whitman might be awakened at any hour to treat accident victims, deliver babies, or respond to disease outbreaks. His sleeping arrangements had to accommodate the need for quick departures and the possibility of being away from home base for days or weeks at a time. Medical practice also involved a lot of physical labor, lifting unconscious patients, restraining people during surgery without anesthesia, and traveling long distances on horseback or foot to reach patients. Frontier doctors were often exhausted from physical exertion as well as mental stress. The primitive state of medical understanding meant that doctors were often dealing with diseases and conditions they couldn't diagnose or treat effectively. This led to high levels of professional frustration and personal guilt when patients died from conditions that might be easily treatable today. Frontier doctors had to maintain their medical knowledge through correspondence with colleagues, medical journals that might be months out of date, and their own observations and experiments. Their sleeping quarters often served as libraries and laboratories where they studied medical texts and tried to understand the diseases they were encountering. Homesteader families who took advantage of the Homestead Act to claim free land faced sleeping challenges that changed dramatically with the seasons and evolved as they gradually built up their farms and communities. The Johansen family arrived in Nebraska in 1874 with a wagon, some tools, a few household possessions, and the legal right to claim 160 acres of prairie land. Their first sleeping arrangement was the wagon itself, which had to serve as home, storage facility, and shelter while they figured out how to survive on the open plains. The Homestead Act required settlers to build a dwelling and live on their claim for 5 years before they could receive clear title to the land. But the law didn't specify what kind of dwelling, leading to creative interpretations that prioritized legal compliance over actual livability. Many homesteaders built sod houses, structures made from prairie sod cut into blocks and stacked like bricks. These soddies were cheap, used readily available materials, and provided reasonable insulation, but they also leaked mud when it rained, harbored insects and small animals, and were nearly impossible to keep clean. Inside a sod house, the Johansen family's sleeping arrangements were determined by the size of the structure, usually one room about 12 by 14 feet, the number of family members, often 6 to 8 people, and the need to share space with stored food, farm equipment, and sometimes farm animals during severe weather. The dirt floor was often covered with whatever materials the family could find or afford: wooden planks if they were prosperous, canvas or old carpets if they were lucky, or just packed earth covered with quilts if they were poor. Sleeping directly on dirt floors led to health problems that were considered normal parts of frontier life. Seasonal changes created dramatically different sleeping conditions for homesteader families. Summer meant heat, insects, and humidity that made the sod house feel like a steam bath. Winter meant cold that could literally freeze water solid inside the house, creating conditions where families had to sleep with all their clothes on under every blanket they owned. The isolation of homestead life meant that families had to be completely self-sufficient for months at a time. If someone got sick during the winter, there might be no way to get medical help until spring. If the house collapsed or caught fire, there might be no neighbors close enough to provide assistance. Homesteader children grew up sleeping in conditions that would be considered child abuse by modern standards, but they also developed resilience, self-reliance, and practical skills that served them well in later life. They learned to sleep through blizzards, heat waves, and the constant stress of marginal survival. The gradual improvement of homestead sleeping conditions reflected the family's growing success and security. The first year might be spent sleeping in a wagon or dugout. The second year might see the completion of a sod house. By the 5th year, a successful family might have a wooden house with multiple rooms and glass windows, but this progression wasn't guaranteed. Crop failures, severe weather, illness, or economic downturns could force families to abandon their claims and move on, starting the process over again somewhere else. The frontier was littered with abandoned homesteads, where families had given up their dreams of land ownership and comfortable sleeping arrangements. The mountain men and fur trappers who worked in the Rocky Mountains and other wilderness areas had sleeping arrangements that were determined by weather, wildlife, and the constant movement required by their profession. Jim Bridger, one of the most famous mountain men, spent months at a time in wilderness areas where the only shelter was whatever he could create from natural materials and his own ingenuity. His sleeping arrangements had to be portable, weather-resistant, and defensible against both animal and human threats. Mountain men carried their sleeping equipment with them on horseback or on foot, which meant every item had to be lightweight, multi-purpose, and durable enough to last for months of hard use. A typical mountain man's sleeping gear might consist of a buffalo robe, a wool blanket, a piece of canvas for ground cover, and whatever additional materials he could improvise from his environment. The work of fur trapping required men to spend time in remote locations during the winter months, when animal pelts were at their prime quality. This meant setting up temporary camps in areas where temperatures could drop to 30 or 40 degrees below zero, with no shelter, except what could be built from local materials. Mountain men developed sophisticated knowledge of wilderness survival that included understanding of weather patterns, animal behavior, and environmental resources. They knew how to select sleeping sites that provided protection from wind and predators, while also offering escape routes if necessary. The social isolation of mountain man life meant that these men often went months without seeing another human being. Their sleeping arrangements reflected this solitude. They slept alone, with weapons close at hand, in locations chosen for security rather than comfort. But mountain men also gathered for annual rendezvous where hundreds of trappers, traders, and Native Americans would come together to trade furs, purchase supplies, and socialize after months of isolation. These gatherings created temporary communities with their own sleeping arrangements and social dynamics. The rendezvous camps were like frontier festivals where normal social rules were suspended and men who had been living alone for months tried to readjust to human company. The sleeping arrangements at these gatherings were chaotic, with men passing out wherever they happened to be when exhaustion or alcohol overcame them. Mountain men who survived for years in the wilderness developed almost supernatural survival skills, but they also paid physical and psychological costs that shortened their lives and made it difficult for them to readjust to civilized life. Many mountain men who tried to retire to settled communities found that they couldn't sleep indoors or adapt to the social expectations of town life. The decline of the fur trade in the 1840s forced many mountain men to find new occupations as guides, scouts, or settlers, but they brought their wilderness sleeping skills and survival knowledge to these new roles. The techniques they had developed for sleeping comfortably and safely in the wilderness became part of the broader frontier survival toolkit. Stagecoach drivers and the workers who maintained the relay stations along major routes had sleeping arrangements that were determined by rigid schedules, dangerous working conditions, and the need to provide services to travelers in remote locations. Charlie Goodnight drove stagecoaches on the route between Kansas City and Santa Fe, a journey that took weeks and required precise timing to coordinate with relay stations, avoid hostile territory, and deliver mail and passengers safely. His sleeping schedule was determined by the stagecoach timetable, not by human biological needs. Stagecoach drivers had to be ready to travel at any hour of the day or night, depending on when their relief was scheduled and whether there were any delays or emergencies along the route. This meant that Charlie might work for 18 hours straight, catch 4 hours of sleep, then get back on the driver's seat for another marathon session. The relay stations, where drivers rested between runs, were some of the most primitive accommodations on the frontier. These stations were built quickly and cheaply in remote locations, designed more for functionality than comfort. A typical relay station might consist of a one-room cabin, a corral for horses, and whatever outbuildings were necessary for basic operations. Station keepers and their families lived at these remote outposts for months at a time, providing food and shelter for drivers and passengers, while also maintaining the horses and equipment necessary for stagecoach operations. Their sleeping arrangements were complicated by the irregular arrival of stagecoaches and the need to be available for service at any hour. The stagecoach relay stations were frequent targets for outlaws, Native American raids, and simple robbery attempts. The stations contained valuable horses, cash from passenger fares, and mail that might include money or other valuables. This meant that station workers had to sleep with weapons close at hand and be ready to defend the station at any moment. The isolation of relay stations meant that if there was trouble, help might be days or weeks away. Station workers had to be completely self-sufficient and capable of handling any emergency that might arise. Their sleeping arrangements reflected this need for constant vigilance and readiness. Weather was always a factor in stagecoach operations, and drivers had to be prepared to work through blizzards, thunderstorms, and heat waves that would shut down modern transportation systems. Their sleeping arrangements had to accommodate wet clothes, extreme temperatures, and the physical exhaustion that came from fighting the elements for hours at a time. The physical demands of driving stagecoaches over rough terrain while controlling teams of horses created chronic health problems that affected sleep quality. Charlie might spend his rest periods dealing with back pain from bouncing on a hard driver's seat, arm and shoulder pain from controlling unruly horses, and general exhaustion from the constant stress of keeping passengers and cargo safe. Traveling salesmen and entrepreneurs who followed the frontier to sell goods and services to new communities had sleeping arrangements that reflected both their business needs and their often precarious financial situations. Elias Buttonworth sold everything from patent medicines to farming equipment to household goods, traveling from town to town with a wagon full of merchandise and a head full of sales pitches. His sleeping arrangements were determined by his sales success, his relationships with local merchants, and his ability to avoid the customers who might be dissatisfied with their previous purchases. When business was good, Buttonworth could afford to stay in the best accommodations available in each town. When sales were poor, he might end up sleeping in his wagon or camping outside of town until his finances improved. The feast or famine nature of frontier sales work meant that his sleeping conditions could change dramatically from night to night. Traveling salesmen carried valuable merchandise that made them targets for robbery, but they also needed to display their goods to potential customers. This created security challenges that affected where and how they could sleep. Buttonworth had to find ways to protect his inventory, while also making it accessible for business purposes. The social dynamics of frontier communities affected traveling salesmen's sleeping arrangements in complex ways. A successful salesman might be welcomed as a valuable source of goods and information from the outside world. An unsuccessful or dishonest salesman might find himself unwelcome in local accommodations and forced to seek shelter elsewhere. Frontier entrepreneurs often combined multiple business activities to increase their chances of success. Buttonworth might sell patent medicines in the morning, repair clocks in the afternoon, and provide entertainment in the evening, all while looking for investment opportunities or potential business partnerships. The irregular income of frontier entrepreneurship meant that business people had to be flexible about their sleeping arrangements and willing to accept whatever accommodations they could afford at any given time. Success could mean comfortable hotel rooms and restaurant meals, while failure might mean sleeping outdoors and going hungry. Traveling salesmen served as important sources of information and communication between frontier communities. They carried news, letters, and gossip from town to town, making them valuable additions to any community's social life. Their sleeping arrangements often reflected their role as information brokers and entertainment providers. The seasonal nature of frontier business meant that entrepreneurs had to adjust their activities and sleeping arrangements to accommodate weather patterns, agricultural cycles, and the availability of customers. Summer might mean constant travel and irregular sleep, while winter might require finding a base of operations and waiting for spring to resume business activities. As frontier communities developed and prospered, the evolution of sleeping accommodations reflected broader changes in architecture, available materials, and community priorities that gradually improved living conditions for everyone. The progression from dugouts to sod houses to log cabins to frame houses represented not just individual prosperity, but community development that made better materials and skilled craftsmen available to frontier settlers. Early frontier buildings were constructed using whatever materials were locally available and could be harvested with minimal tools and skills. This led to regional variations in building styles that reflected local resources. Sod houses on the treeless plains, log cabins in forested areas, adobe structures in the southwest. But as communities grew and transportation improved, settlers gained access to milled lumber, glass windows, metal hardware, and other manufactured goods that allowed for more sophisticated construction. The introduction of railroads was particularly important because it made heavy materials like window glass and iron stoves economically feasible in frontier locations. Skilled craftsmen gradually became available in frontier communities as populations grew and economic opportunities developed. Carpenters, masons, and other construction workers brought knowledge of building techniques that had been developed in more established areas. The development of local industries also improved building materials and techniques. Sawmills, brick kilns, and quarries provided locally produced materials that were cheaper and more readily available than imported goods. Building codes and community standards gradually developed as towns grew and local governments were established. These codes were usually minimal by modern standards, but they represented important improvements in safety and sanitation compared to the complete lack of regulation that characterized early frontier construction. The availability of credit and banking services made it possible for settlers to invest in better housing without having to accumulate the full cost in advance. This allowed families to build more substantial homes sooner than would have been possible with cash-only transactions. Community cooperation in construction projects, barn raisings, house raisings, and other group efforts made it possible to build larger and more complex structures than individual families could manage alone. These community projects also strengthened social bonds and established standards for housing quality. The gradual improvement of sleeping accommodations reflected broader social and economic development that made frontier communities more attractive to new settlers and encouraged existing residents to stay and invest in permanent improvements rather than moving on to new opportunities. Women played crucial roles in creating and maintaining sleeping arrangements on the frontier, but their contributions were often overlooked or undervalued in historical accounts that focused on male activities and experiences. Women were responsible for most aspects of domestic life, including bedding, cleaning, cooking, and healthcare, all of which directly affected sleeping conditions for entire families and communities. Their knowledge and skills were essential for survival, but they worked within social and economic constraints that limited their options and recognition. Frontier women developed sophisticated strategies for managing household resources, creating comfort from minimal materials and maintaining health and hygiene in challenging conditions. They knew how to make soap from animal fat and lye, how to preserve food without refrigeration, how to treat illnesses with herbal remedies, and how to create warm, clean bedding from whatever materials were available. The social expectations surrounding women's roles meant that they were responsible for domestic comfort while having little control over the economic decisions that determined housing quality, location, and resources. Women might work miracles with household management while having no voice in decisions about where the family would live or what kind of shelter they could afford. Women's experiences of frontier sleeping conditions were often different from men's experiences because of social restrictions, safety concerns, and reproductive health issues that weren't well understood or adequately addressed by frontier medicine and social customs. Pregnant women and new mothers faced particular challenges in frontier sleeping conditions, dealing with health problems that were complicated by poor nutrition, inadequate medical care, and living conditions that increased the risk of infection and other complications. Women traveling alone or in groups faced unique safety and accommodation challenges that required different strategies and resources than those used by male travelers. The social restrictions on women's behavior and the genuine safety risks they faced limited their options and often forced them to accept inferior accommodations. The domestic skills that women developed on the frontier, resource management, healthcare, food preservation, textile production, were essential for community survival and development, but they were often considered natural female abilities rather than learned skills worthy of recognition or compensation. Women's letters, diaries, and memoirs provide some of our best insights into the daily realities of frontier sleeping conditions because they were more likely than men to write about domestic life, family relationships, and the emotional aspects of frontier living. The gradual improvement of frontier sleeping conditions often reflected women's influence and priorities as they advocated for better housing, sanitation, and community amenities that would benefit families and children. The chronic sleep deprivation that was normal for frontier life had psychological effects that influenced individual behavior, community dynamics, and the overall character of frontier society in ways that we're only beginning to understand. Modern sleep research has shown that chronic sleep deprivation affects judgment, emotional regulation, immune system function, and cognitive performance in ways that would have made frontier life even more dangerous and difficult than it already was. Frontier people dealing with constant sleep deprivation would have been more prone to accidents, more likely to make poor decisions, more susceptible to illness, and more likely to have conflicts with other people. These effects would have been compounded by the other stresses of frontier life: inadequate nutrition, exposure to diseases, physical danger, and social isolation. The high levels of alcohol consumption that were common on the frontier may have been partly an attempt to self-medicate sleep problems, but alcohol actually worsens sleep quality and creates additional health and social problems. The social dynamics of frontier communities, the quick tempers, the readiness to resort to violence, the difficulty in maintaining stable relationships, may have been partly the result of chronic sleep deprivation affecting entire populations. The psychological stress of frontier life was compounded by sleeping arrangements that provided no privacy, no quiet, and no personal space. People who were already dealing with the trauma of leaving familiar places, facing constant dangers, and struggling to survive were forced to sleep in conditions that would challenge anyone's mental health. The lack of understanding about mental health meant that psychological problems related to sleep deprivation and stress were often dismissed as character flaws or moral failings rather than legitimate health issues that needed attention and treatment. Many frontier people developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions that were made worse by chronic sleep problems and the inability to get adequate rest and recovery. The frontier emphasis on toughness and self-reliance meant that people were discouraged from complaining about sleep problems or seeking help for psychological difficulties. This created a culture where mental health problems were ignored until they became severe enough to affect work performance or community safety. The long-term effects of frontier sleep deprivation may have influenced the character and culture of American society in ways that persisted long after frontier conditions improved. The emphasis on individual toughness, the tolerance for discomfort, and the suspicion of soft living may have roots in the frontier experience of learning to function without adequate rest. As we reach the true end of our exhaustive journey through the weird, wonderful, and utterly disgusting world of frontier sleeping habits, it's worth reflecting on how completely this world disappeared and how quickly it was forgotten. By 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the frontier was officially closed. There was no longer a clear line between settled and unsettled territory. The sleeping nightmares we've explored tonight were already becoming historical curiosities, rather than daily realities for most Americans. The transformation happened with stunning speed. In 1870, the sleeping conditions we've described were normal for millions of Americans. By 1920, they were so unusual that people who had lived through them seemed like survivors of an alien world. What made the difference? Technology, obviously. Railroads, telegraph communications, manufacturing, and gradually improving transportation that made goods and services available in remote areas, but also economic development, population growth, and the establishment of institutions that could enforce standards and provide services. The frontier sleeping experience became part of American mythology rather than American reality. The cowboys, mountain men, and pioneers we've been talking about became romanticized figures in popular culture, but the actual physical discomfort and psychological stress of their sleeping conditions were forgotten or ignored. This romanticization served important cultural purposes. It created national heroes and origin stories that helped Americans understand their national identity. But it also obscured the genuine suffering and hardship that frontier people endured, and the remarkable resilience they demonstrated in surviving impossible conditions. The speed with which Americans forgot about frontier sleeping conditions reflects the speed with which living standards improved. Each generation had better housing, better bedding, better heating and cooling, and more privacy than the generation before. The improvements happened so quickly that within one lifetime, frontier conditions seemed unbelievably primitive. But the frontier sleeping experience left permanent marks on American culture that we can still see today. The emphasis on self-reliance, the tolerance for temporary discomfort in pursuit of long-term goals, the ability to adapt to new circumstances, and the willingness to help strangers in difficult situations all have roots in the frontier experience. The frontier taught Americans that comfort is something to be earned rather than expected, that cooperation is essential for survival, and that human beings are capable of enduring conditions that seem impossible. These lessons became part of the national character in ways that persist, even though the conditions that created them are long gone. Perhaps most importantly, the frontier experience demonstrated that social arrangements that seem permanent and natural can actually change very quickly when circumstances require it. The sleeping conditions that seem normal and inevitable to frontier people were transformed within a few decades by changes in technology, economics, and social organization. This gives us hope that other problems that seem intractable, homelessness, poverty, social inequality, might also be solvable with the right combination of resources, technology, and social will. The frontier experience shows that human beings are remarkably adaptable, and that social conditions that seem permanent can actually change very quickly. So, as we conclude this marathon exploration of frontier sleeping habits, remember that you're not just learning about the past. You're learning about human adaptability, resilience, and the power of social cooperation to overcome impossible challenges. The next time you're lying in your comfortable bed, in your quiet room, with your clean sheets and your privacy, remember that you're experiencing something that would have seemed like a miracle to most of human history. But also remember that you're carrying forward the legacy of people who faced impossible challenges with courage, ingenuity, and determination. They didn't just survive, they built the foundation for the world you inhabit today. Every comfortable night's sleep you enjoy is a tribute to their sacrifice and endurance. Sweet dreams, everyone. You've earned them by surviving this journey through the sleeping nightmares of the Wild West. And remember, if you enjoyed this deep dive into historical discomfort, hit that like button, subscribe for more explorations of the weird and wonderful past, and let me know in the comments what other aspects of historical life you'd like to explore. Until next time.